A verb is a part of speech that is an action word. It depicts movement, action, or a state of being. Now, when we look at verbs, one type of verb is a common verb. Now, some examples of common verbs are talk, sing, run, think, and drive. Then you have verbs that convey a state of being, such as to have or to be. Then you have linking verbs. We call them linking verbs because what they do is they link the subject to additional info. So, for example, with linking verbs, you have to be, the forms of to be, are, is, and were. Forms of to become, become, and became. For example, the horse became famous overnight. Another common linking verb, to seem, forms of to seem, seems and will seem. For example, Connie seems sad. Now there are some verbs that are both linking and common, and that's based on how they're used. For example, examples of verbs that are both action and linking are look, get, stay, smell, and feel. For example, smell being used as a common linking verb. The meat smelled funny, linking the subject meat with additional info, funny, describing the smell of the meat. Then smell as an action verb. He smelled the flowers.
ACT English sentence structure. Adverbs can be used to compare and contrast dissimilar actions. So the comparative form of a word is used to compare two actions, and the superlative form of a word is used to refer to one in a group of three or more that is the outstanding example of the action. So when we're dealing with one-syllable adverbs, we use the suffix er or est, or we use the words less or least. So say we have the word late. To get to the comparative form of the word late, we just add the suffix er to make it later. So if we have two people and one person is late by an hour and the other person is late by 2 hours, we would refer to the person late by 2 hours as being the later one. And then if we have three or more people and one person is late by 3 hours, we would refer to them as being the latest person. So that's the superlative form, latest. So we're just adding these suffixes, and really in later we're just adding r, and in latest we're just adding st because we already had e from late. Now to look at this in a more negative sense, you could use the words less or least. So you could refer to one person as being less late and another person as being the least late. Now, when you have an adverb with two or more syllables, you don't use a suffix anymore. You just use the words more or most or less or least. So we have the word carefully, and if two people both do something carefully, you would say that one person did it more carefully. And you could also say that one person did it less carefully, depending on how you want to look at it. And then also with the superlative form, if you have three or more, you would refer to one person as doing it the most carefully. And then you can refer to the person who wasn't very careful as being doing something the least carefully. Now we do have something called irregular adverbs, and what I mean by irregular is that they're irregular in the way you form the comparative and superlative forms of the adverb. So for example, we have the word well. Now the comparative form of the word well is better, and the superlative form is the best. So as you can see, better and best aren't in any way close to the word well. And so you just have to be familiar with these irregular adverbs and be familiar with how to form the comparative and superlative forms of those words. So again, adverbs can be used to compare and contrast dissimilar actions. And we use the comparative form when we're comparing two actions, and we use the superlative form when we're comparing 3 or more actions.
Today we want to go over just a few of the rules related to apostrophes and their use for showing possession of something. So you've got a noun that possesses something else and you want to show possession. Sometimes it can be confusing to know where exactly to put that apostrophe. Before the S, after the S, do I add an extra S? And so we just want to go over not all the rules related to the use of apostrophes, but just a few of the select ones. And I've got them on the board here behind me, so we're going to go over those briefly. Once again, apostrophes related to possession, not apostrophes in contractions or things like this, but to show possession. If there is a plural noun that ends in S, the apostrophe comes at the end, and there's no need to add an extra S. So when we think of the plural noun students, meaning more than one, and we want to talk about something that belongs collectively to the students, like their hats, the way you would write it is the students, apostrophe, hats. You would not include an extra S. It wouldn't be the students, apostrophe S, students' hats. It would just be the students' hats. Next, then, you have a plural noun that does not end in S. In this case, the apostrophe comes after the word, and then you do add an S. So in this case, the plural for man is men, and you want to talk about the men's meeting. So you put the word men, apostrophe, S, and meeting. So in the first one, it's a plural noun that ends in S. You just put the apostrophe and you're done. And the second one, the plural does not end in S, so you add the apostrophe, then the S, and what's possessed. And then finally, if you've got a singular noun that ends you've got a singular noun, it ends with the apostrophe S basically. So a singular noun, like our first one up here, we had a plural noun. The singular of students is student, and we want to talk about one student's hat. Then we put the word student, apostrophe S, hat. So it mimics this rule here, number 2. So a singular noun, you end with apostrophe S, the student's hat. For names that end in S, proper names, things like that, you don't have to add another S at the end, but it is customary to do so. So when you talk about the Joneses' house or Texas's weather, the way you do it is the word Texas, apostrophe S, weather. Now it would be fine, it would be acceptable if you just put Texas, apostrophe, weather, and people would know it means Texas's weather. And the same with Jones. The Joneses' house, you would put Jones, apostrophe, S, or you could put Jones and then apostrophe. Either would be acceptable, so it's not required to put the extra S, but it is customary. Now, you never use an apostrophe when you're just talking about like the Joneses themselves in the plural. The Joneses went to Africa. In that case, you put Jones and then ES. You don't put an apostrophe there at all. But anyway, in terms of apostrophes and possession, just to review and hopefully make it clear, if it's a plural noun that ends in S, all you do is put the apostrophe on the end. Students, hats. If it's a plural noun that does not end in S, then you put an apostrophe S, men's meeting, mice's feet. If it's a singular noun, then you just put the noun apostrophe S to show possession. With formal things like Jones and Texas, just an apostrophe at the end is fine, but if you put an apostrophe S, that would actually be more customary. I hope this has been clear. If not, or you'd like to learn more about this, then underneath this video, if you look right beneath the video, there's a link there. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has related information to this, more information about things related to this. And also on that website, you'll find a link there to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
When looking at a passage, it's good to determine the author's main point and their purpose. So another term for main point would be main idea. So basically, this is what the author is trying to convey. It's the most important information that the author is trying to convey to the reader. Then there's purpose. This is why the author is trying to convey the information. So we could say that the main point is the what, and the purpose is the why. Because the purpose is what the author is hoping to achieve by sharing the information with you. So purpose is the why behind the what. Purpose is the reason you're sharing the what. So, an example of this would be that an author's main point could be that yellow lights should be longer. And their premises for that, or what backs up their belief about that, is that longer yellow lights will save lives through reduced traffic accidents. So the purpose here, the reason that the author would share this main point with you and the evidence behind it, is to make you also believe that yellow lights should be longer. So that's just an elementary example of that. So we have a passage right here, and we're not going to look for the purpose in this main passage. We're just going to look at the author's main point. So this says, people need to appreciate public schools. The school year should be increased by 2 weeks. This would allow for increased instruction in core subject areas. This would also shorten the summer break, which would lessen the amount of time for students to forget what they learned. So, this first sentence here says people need to appreciate public schools. So, could that be a conclusion or a main point? Another word for main point is a conclusion. So we have main point, and then I'll put in parentheses here, conclusion. And then we have premises that back up a main point. This is basically kind of the evidence or the reasons behind that main point. So, could this be a main point? Yes, but let's keep moving on and see if that's really the main point of this passage. The next sentence says the school year should be increased by 2 weeks. Could that be a main point? Absolutely. Now, remember, a main point needs to have premises, things to back it up, facts, figures, arguments, anything like that to back it up. Okay? So, these next two sentences talk about why it'd be good to increase the school year by 2 weeks. They don't talk about why people need to appreciate public schools more. So these two sentences, these last two sentences are basically premises backing up this sentence right here, saying the school year should be increased by 2 weeks. So this second sentence here is the main point. This first sentence is really a distractor. Now, in kind of a roundabout way, if the school year was increased by 2 weeks, then maybe people would begin to appreciate public schools more and begin to appreciate all that they're teaching children. But that's kind of a roundabout way, and these two premises right here relate more directly to this sentence here than they do this first sentence. So premises can be thought of as the foundations or the building blocks for the main point. Without premises, a main point crumbles because there's nothing to back it up. So you have to have those premises. So that's a look at author's main point or purpose. ACT, English, sentence structure. An independent clause contains a subject and a verb, and it's a complete thought. So an independent clause can stand by itself, so it can be a sentence. Like the sentence, I am running. See here we have a subject, I, and then we have this verb phrase, am, and running. And so it's a complete thought. It can stand alone and be a sentence. Now, sometimes independent clauses have other clauses grouped with them, but they can also stand alone. Now, a dependent clause also contains a subject and verb. However, it is an incomplete thought. And so we can take this independent clause up here and just add the word because to it, and it becomes a dependent clause. Because I am running still has a subject and a verb, but now we have the word because, and so it's a dependent clause. It's not a complete thought. You can't just say because I am running. You need something to go with it, like because I am running, I can't come to the meeting. And so that would be a complete sentence. So that's what a dependent clause is. Now, a noun clause can be a subject, a direct object, which I will abbreviate DO, an indirect object, abbreviated IO, or an object of a preposition. So a noun clause can begin with WH question words like what, which, when, where, who, or whom. and question words like how or if. Now, an adjective clause modifies a noun or pronoun. So an adjective clause begins with a word like who, whom, which, that, whose, when, where, why. And it's going to follow the word it modifies. Then finally we have an adverb clause, which modifies a verb, an adjective, another adverb, or an object of a preposition. Now, an adverb clause begins with a subordinating conjunction, such as after, because, since, unless, etc. And an adverb clause answers the question when, where, why, how, or to what degree, or under what condition. So that's a look at some different types of clauses.
Common comma functions. Commas have many different functions, but their three primary functions are to separate clauses, join independent clauses, and they're used to avoid confusion. So since we talked about separating and joining clauses, let's first talk about what a clause is. A clause is a piece of a sentence. If you have a dependent clause, it is dependent on the rest of the sentence. It cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. It would be a fragment. If you have an independent clause, it would be able to stand alone as a sentence. It would be independently a sentence on its own. So dependent clause can't be a sentence by itself, depends on the rest of the sentence. Independent clause stands alone, can be a sentence all by itself. So let's look at how we can separate clauses with commas. You will use a comma to separate a dependent introductory clause from an independent clause. So one way that dependent clauses are used is as an introduction to a sentence. For instance, before the game, Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. We use this comma to separate the dependent clause. So before the game is dependent. You cannot say before the game all by itself and have it be a complete sentence. It's only a prepositional phrase. So it is a dependent clause. But then you have Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. This would be independent. It could stand all by itself. So we are separating the dependent introductory clause from the independent clause. Before the game, Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. And you notice how you pause where that comma is. And a lot of times, that's why a comma is there, to get you to pause so that your sentence makes sense as you're reading it, either to yourself in a book or aloud to someone else. So, dependent clause as an introduction needs a comma. Now, let's look at if we kind of switch the order of the sentence up. Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast before the game. When we put before the game at the end of the sentence, we don't need to have that comma anymore. We only needed the comma whenever we wanted to pause to let people know that before the game was separate and to realize the action was happening after that. So Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast before the game. Here, we didn't actually have to put a comma because the independent clause came first. So we had our dependent clause at the end, no comma needed. Now this is in this situation. That doesn't mean there will never be a situation where you will have a dependent clause at the end that needs a comma. If you have several items in a series, you may still need a comma toward the end of the sentence. But if you're using an introductory phrase, if it comes at the beginning of the sentence, you need the comma. If it comes at the end of a sentence, generally you won't. Let's look at another way that we use commas to separate clauses. You will use a comma to separate two independent clauses joined by any of the following conjunctions. And a conjunction is basically a connector word. And, but, or, for, nor, so, and yet are common conjunctions. If you have two independent clauses, that means two phrases in a sentence that could stand as a sentence on their own, and they're connected by one of these conjunctions, then you will need a comma to separate those two. We are going to the movies, or we are going to a nice restaurant. So here's our conjunction, or. We are going to the movies is an independent clause. We are going to a nice restaurant is an independent clause. So the comma is needed to separate two independent clauses. Now let's look at if we combine this sentence a different way. We are going to the movies or to a nice restaurant. Here we have that or, which would be a conjunction, but let's look. We are going to the movies is an independent clause. To a nice restaurant is dependent. To a nice restaurant cannot stand by itself. We don't have a subject in that clause. In this version of the sentence, we had we are going still included. So we still had a subject and a verb, so this was a complete thought all by itself. So it was an independent clause. It could stand as a sentence. To a nice restaurant is missing that. It's missing both your subject and your verb. It's not been made a complete sentence, so it's dependent on the rest of the sentence to make sense. So in this instance, we did not have two independent clauses. So no comma was needed. Okay, now let's look at the second primary function of a comma. To join independent clauses, to avoid short, choppy sentences. So generally, whenever we are going to join independent clauses, we're doing it so that we don't have a series of short, choppy sentences. Now you're going to see that this might look a little similar to where we separated independent clauses. Sarah plays softball and Sarah enjoys swimming. Okay, and this one we had an independent clause, or a conjunction, and an independent clause. Let's look at the next version of this set of clauses. Sarah plays softball, runs track, and enjoys swimming. So Sarah plays softball. This is independent. Runs track is dependent. We have our conjunction, and enjoys swimming is dependent. Yet we still had those commas. And then let's look at the last version. Sarah plays softball, Sarah runs track, Sarah enjoys swimming. So all three of these are going to be independent clauses because they are complete sentences. But they're short, choppy sentences. Sarah plays softball, Sarah runs track, Sarah enjoys swimming. We keep hearing Sarah over and over, and these sentences are short. We can combine them to make it a smoother flowing sentence. So you could have two independent clauses joined by a conjunction like we did up here, and then you would use that comma to separate them. but you are still joining multiple sentences when you do that. So you're using those commas to separate the clauses, but you are using them to also join two sentences into one. So, Sarah plays softball and Sarah enjoys swimming. So here, we used our comma to join these two independent thoughts. Sarah plays softball, runs track, and enjoys swimming. Well, we had dependent clauses here, but we still had a conjunction. The reason we're going to put commas here is because you've got 3 or more items in a series. If you list 3 or more items or clauses, activities in a series, you're going to separate them with commas. So the reason we're using it here is to separate 3 or more items in a series. Here we were using it to separate 2 independent clauses. And then at the end we had no commas. We just had 3 complete sentences, which basically equaled 3 independent clauses. So we had to find ways to combine them. So we could combine all 3 into one sentence, and we could use our rule of using 3 or more commas in a series to join these different independent clauses, or we could use our rule of separating 2 independent clauses with a comma and a conjunction and keep 2 independent clauses instead of separating it up and making it dependent clauses but 3 different activities in a series. We could say Sarah collects bananas, apples, and tomatoes. We would have to put commas in that series too. Sarah collects bananas, comma, tomatoes, comma, and apples. So, when you have 3 or more items in a series, you have to put your commas to separate them. This is going to be helpful when you're combining different ideas to be able to join independent clauses and in other instances. If you have just 2 sentences that you would like to combine, you can do so using a conjunction and a comma. As long as it's still an independent clause on each side, you will need that comma. Let's look at the third primary function of a comma. They are used to avoid confusion. I want to eat chicken, broccoli, and corn for dinner. Without a comma in this sentence, it sounds like you're saying you want to eat chicken broccoli. Well, you probably don't know what chicken broccoli is, and that's because it's not a real food. What would make more sense is if we said I want to eat chicken, comma, broccoli, comma, and corn for dinner. Then you would be telling someone you would like to eat chicken, broccoli, and corn. 3 items, not chicken broccoli, which makes chicken look like an adjective to broccoli. Now, this comma here in a series, if you have 3 or more items, the comma immediately before and is optional. Some people like the way it looks, some don't. I like the way the comma looks. It helps me feel more organized when I'm writing, so I always put it in. But you definitely need this comma because otherwise the meaning of your sentence is unclear and you would not be avoiding that confusion that commas are supposed to help you avoid. Let's look at the next example. Before we eat, our dog has to eat. This doesn't make sense. Before we eat our dog. You're not going to eat your dog. But if you're reading this sentence quickly, without a comma there to slow you down and make you pause, you don't read it correctly. You would have to read it a second or third time to get what the author's meaning actually was. So you would say, before we eat, our dog has to eat. And maybe this is so that your dog isn't going to bother you while you eat. If your dog's already eaten, then you can eat happily. So before we eat, our dog has to eat. And this is one of those dependent introductory clauses like we talked about up here. We use it to separate, we use a comma to separate clauses, and that can also avoid confusion. So you see how some of these rules tie in together. Commas in a series, commas in a series. Introductory clause being separated from the independent clause that is the rest of the sentence. Dependent clause separated from independent clause. So a lot of the rules of commas may overlap a little bit, but These are three of the primary functions you're going to see commas used for. That doesn't mean you won't see them used any other way. They're also used geographically if you're talking about a city inside of a country or inside of a state. If you're talking about dates or times, then you may also use commas. Commas are used in people's names sometimes if you're putting a junior or a senior. So these aren't the only times you're going to see commas, but in writing, these are the primary functions in which you are going to see commas used.
There are two primary uses for the semicolon in the English language. The first is to separate two closely related independent clauses within a sentence. If you use a semicolon, there's no need to include a coordinating conjunction such as and. The second use for a semicolon is to separate items in a list when the items are long and complicated or contain internal punctuation such as a comma. Ordinarily, you would use a comma to separate items in a list, but if the items contain commas within them, it may be confusing to separate the items with a comma. So that's where the semicolon comes in. Here we have one example sentence for each usage. In this first one, we have two independent clauses separated by a semicolon. So each of these clauses could stand on its own as a sentence, but we've chosen to combine them into a single sentence, and we do so with a semicolon. It's proper to use a semicolon in this sentence because the two phrases, I went to the doctor and he told me I had the flu, are very closely related to one another. Hearing that you have the flu is a direct result of going to the doctor. You would not, for instance, be able to use a semicolon in a situation where your two clauses were, I went to the doctor, I scored a 99 on my exam, because they're not related in the same way that these are. So in order to use a semicolon to separate two independent clauses, the two clauses must be very closely related to one another. The second example was items in a list. So as you can see here, we've got three items, and they are city-state combinations. So you'll recall the proper way to list out cities and states is city, comma, state. So each item has an internal comma. So it could be confusing to try to separate them with commas, so the proper usage in this instance is to use a semicolon to separate each of them. So these are the two primary uses for semicolons in English.
When you have adjectives in a series, sometimes they are divided up by commas and sometimes they are not. So I want to take a look at when you need to use a comma and when you don't need to use a comma. This first sentence says, an interesting blue box. Now you notice that interesting and blue are both adjectives because they describe box. But do you need a comma between interesting and blue? The answer is you do not, because there's a simple test you can use to decide whether you need a comma or not. The question is, can you use or can you insert and or but in between the two adjectives? So if we insert and between interesting and blue, would it make sense? Interesting and blue box. That doesn't really sound right. You wouldn't say that in a sentence. Can we insert the word but? Interesting but blue box? That really doesn't make sense either. So since we can't insert and or but in between the two words, then we don't need a comma. So take a look at this next sentence. It says, a serious, kind man. Serious and kind are both adjectives describing man. And a comma separates the two adjectives. Why? Because try inserting and between the two adjectives. A serious and kind man. Well, that doesn't really sound right because serious and kind are totally opposite. So let's try inserting but. A serious but kind man. That would make sense. You could write a sentence using that phrasing. So we are going to put a comma in between these two words. Now, although that's a test to figure out whether we need a comma or not, that's not really the reason you need a comma or the reason you don't need a comma. The reason is there's a certain order that adjectives come in. And it's not very easy to describe what order those adjectives need to come in, but when you speak English for a little bit, you just get a feel for what order the adjectives need to come in. So basically, if you have adjectives that are alike, that are kind of describing the same attributes of something that the adjective is describing, then you need to use a comma. In other words, serious and kind are both observations someone can make about a man. They're very similar adjectives, so you need a comma. Now, in this sentence, interesting and blue aren't alike adjectives. Blue is describing the color. It's describing the physical description of the box. Interesting doesn't tell us anything about the physical description of the box. It's just an observation. So right here you have an observation and a physical description, adjective, both describing box, so you don't need a comma. But here you have an observation adjective, serious, and another observation adjective, kind, used to both describe the word man. So serious and kind needs a comma. Let's look at another example, an exciting, interesting box. So here we do need a comma because you could say exciting and interesting box. That would make sense. Exciting and interesting are both observations. So both of these adjectives are very alike. So you use a comma. Now let's take a look at this example, a short, stubby tree. All right, let's try inserting the word but between short and stubby. A short but stubby tree. That doesn't really make sense because short and stubby are alike. Now let's try inserting and. A short and stubby tree. That makes sense. And so we need a comma. Why? Because short and stubby are similar adjectives. They both describe the size of the tree. They both describe the physical description of the tree. So the important thing to take from this is you need a comma when you can insert and or but between the two adjectives, and you don't need to insert a comma when you can't insert a comma between the two adjectives. And in this case, I'm only using two adjectives. Well, sometimes you may only have one adjective for a certain word, which that's fine too, and you don't even have to deal with the question as to whether or not to use a comma. And now sometimes you will have three adjectives for a certain word, and the same rules apply. You may or may not need a comma between the words. And when you get to have more than three adjectives, you are probably using too many adjectives. There may be rare cases where 4 or 5 adjectives are acceptable, but generally you're only going to have 1, 2, or 3 adjectives describing a specific word. Adverb clauses and adverbial phrases are groups of words that play the role of an adverb. So let's take a look at this example sentence on the board. When I complete this task, we can go. Now the meat of this sentence, the subject and verb of this sentence, comes in the later part of the sentence. We can go. We right here is the subject, and can go is the verb phrase. So when I complete this task could actually be removed from the sentence, and the sentence would still make sense. We can go makes perfect sense by itself. So when I complete this task then is an adverb, because adverbs aren't necessarily important to a sentence. You can remove an adverb and the sentence will still make sense without it, because adverbs just merely modify or further describe another word in the sentence. So since we can remove when I complete this task from the rest of the sentence, then it is probably our adverb clause, and it is. Now there's not one word in this adverb clause right here that actually would be an adverb by itself. It's the group of words right here together that modify the verb can go, or the verb phrase can go, because can and go together make up the verb phrase. So when I complete this task is our adverb clause, and it modifies can go. It's answering the question when. When can we go? When I complete this task. Because adverbs often answer a question. So the question here is when, and it's saying when I complete this task. Now notice that it's called a clause. It's called an adverb clause, and that's because clauses contain both a subject and a verb. And that is the case with this group of words right here. You see a subject and a verb. I is the subject, and complete is the verb. All right, so let's look at this next sentence. In a moment, the pizza will be ready. Here, the meat of our sentence is, again, in the later part of the sentence. Pizza is the subject, and will be is the verb phrase. So here again, in a moment could be removed from the sentence. In a moment, the pizza will be ready. Now let's try reading the sentence without this. The pizza will be ready. The sentence still makes sense, so this is probably our adverbial phrase. Now notice this time, it's called an adverbial phrase instead of an adverb clause. Well, what's the reasoning behind that? The reasoning is a clause contains both a subject and a verb. A phrase does not contain a subject and a verb. And here, there's no subject and there's no verb. So that's why it's called an adverbial phrase. This group of words right here, in a moment, describes or modifies will be. Again, it's answering the question when. When will the pizza be ready? It'll be ready in a moment. So the important thing to remember is the main distinction between adverb clauses and adverbial phrases. Adverb clauses are a group of words that modify another word. But the adverbial clause, or the adverb clause, contains both a subject and a verb. In the case of an adverbial phrase, it again is a group of words that modifies another word. But in this case, the adverbial phrase does not contain a subject and a verb. Brackets can be used several ways in sentences. However, you as a writer need to be extremely careful when using brackets, and you need to be careful not to overuse them. So let's take a look at some examples of when it is okay to use brackets. But remember that you need to use brackets sparingly. So this quotation says, "I am very excited." Now, if you as a writer were going to include this quotation in a sentence, you would need to amend this quotation slightly to make it more understandable on the reader's part. So we could say, "I am very excited to be here." Now notice I put the words "to be here" in brackets. That's because that's not something the speaker said. That's something I added into the sentence. So that's why it's in brackets, to show the reader that it's not something the speaker actually said. However, all the words in brackets are still inside the quotation marks because I wasn't saying something contrary to what the speaker said. I'm saying something the speaker probably would have said but didn't. I'm just further clarifying what the speaker said. You can also put words in brackets when you need to change the pronoun form or the verb form of a sentence to help it make sense. Like say I'm talking about the past tense. I could say, "I was very excited," and put that in quotation marks. So I put "was" in a bracket because I changed the verb form. And so brackets just lets the reader know that that's something that the writer amended in that sentence. Another time you can use brackets is if you need to include some extra information inside parentheses. So say you're going along in a sentence, these are just words, then you need to add something and you put it in parentheses. But then you need to add something else inside the parentheses. You could put some words, so there's words inside the parentheses. You want to further clarify, so you put some words in brackets and then close it off with parentheses. So brackets are just used inside parentheses. However, use this sparingly. It's okay to use parentheses around things, but you need to put brackets inside parentheses extremely sparingly. There's not very many instances in which you need to use both parentheses and brackets. So again, use brackets sparingly because lots of brackets make it difficult on the reader's part. However, there are some instances when it's appropriate, like the ones I wrote up here on the board. It is important to capitalize certain words according to grammar rules. Because when you don't follow grammar rules and you capitalize a word you shouldn't, or you don't capitalize a word that you should, it becomes distracting to the reader because they may know that specific grammar rule. And capitalizing certain words helps the reader follow along with your train of thought because it may help them realize when a sentence is beginning or when you're talking about a person's name. So we're going to look at this passage and identify the capitalization errors. So starting out, we're looking good. Then we go to the word January, and we see the J right there. The J is small, and it should be big. So that's one thing we should capitalize, months. Then we continue on to which was a Friday, and we find that the F isn't capitalized. So I'm going to write days. So you don't capitalize the word days, and you don't capitalize the word months, but you do capitalize months of the year, like January, February, December. You capitalize days of the week, like Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And then it says we went to the Museum of Science on a class trip. So museum and science both need to be capitalized because this is a specific place. You don't capitalize of because it's not an important word. So you need to capitalize museum and science. And then notice right here, class does not need to be capitalized because there's no reason why it needs to be capitalized. Now we go to this sentence, and the is not capitalized, even though it's the first letter of the first word of a sentence. So we need to capitalize the first word of a sentence. The class took a bus to the museum. Now you may be thinking that museum needs to be capitalized here as well because we capitalized it over here. But here we're talking about the Museum of Science. It's a specific museum. Here we're just talking about a museum in general, so it's not capitalized. It was a lot of fun. That sentence looks good. My teacher, Mrs. Jones, and some parents came with us. Now the first word of the sentence is capitalized, which is good. Jones is capitalized, which is the last name. We always capitalize last names. But then Mrs. isn't capitalized. And so you need to capitalize abbreviations before names. Abbreviations before names. And so those can be things like Dr., Mr., Ms., Mrs., all those abbreviations need to be capitalized. And so those are some examples of words that do need to be capitalized, but there are many other grammar rules out there, but those are some common words that are accidentally capitalized or accidentally not capitalized. Choosing the correct adjective can sometimes be difficult, especially in certain confusing cases. One of those cases is whether or not to use less or fewer. That is the question. And a lot of people get this confused, so I don't want this to hold you up. Less is used when you're talking about things that aren't countable. Like you would say, there is less sand on this beach than the beach we were at last weekend, because sand's not something that's countable. You use fewer when you're referring to something that is countable. Like there are fewer doors on this house than the last house we lived in, because doors is something that's very countable. Let's take a look at some examples. There are fewer people over here. People is something that's countable, so we use fewer. This sentence says there is less water in this river. Now you could argue that water is something countable, because you could think, oh, you can count water in gallons of water. But we're not talking about gallons of water. We're just talking about water in general, and water is not something that's countable. So we use the adjective less. There is less water in this river. Now this next sentence combines cases in which we can use less and fewer. It says, use less sugar when making fewer cookies. Sugar is not something that's countable. I mean, of course you could count each individual grain of sugar, but overall, sugar is not countable. So we use the adjective less. And then we continue on to the sentence. It says, use less sugar when making fewer cookies. Cookies is something that's very countable. So we use the adjective fewer. Now finally, there is a case which makes this whole case kind of more confusing. When you're talking about something that contains a number, when you're talking about numerical things, you use the adjective less. So this sentence says the shirt will cost less than $20. Now you may think that dollars is something that's very countable. It is, but to be grammatically correct, you use the adjective less. This shirt will cost less than $20. Or this purchase will consume less than 45% of my budget. If you're using a percentage or any kind of statistical or numerical thing in a sentence, you use the adjective less. So that's just a side note you need to remember. But overall, you use less when you're talking about something that's not countable. And you use fewer when you're talking about something that is countable. Today we're going to talk about commas. Now commas have three main functions: to separate clauses, to join independent clauses, and to avoid confusion. So let's take a look at the first use, to separate clauses. This is when you need to separate a dependent clause from an independent clause, as is the case with this sentence. Michael went to the beach after he got ice cream. Michael went to the beach is the independent clause, and after he got ice cream is the dependent clause. Now, to test whether a clause is a dependent clause is just read that clause by itself. So if we were to read after he got ice cream, we would realize that's a dependent clause. It's dependent on the independent clause to make sense. Because if I just say after he got ice cream, that doesn't make very much sense. You're thinking, okay, what happened after he got ice cream? So Michael went to the beach is the independent clause because it can stand by itself, and after he got ice cream is the dependent clause. Now, dependent clauses can actually come before or after an independent clause. In fact, they can actually come inside the independent clause as well. So we could reverse this sentence and we could say, after he got ice cream, Michael went to the beach. There again, after he got ice cream is still the dependent clause, and Michael went to the beach is still the independent clause. The sentence is just constructed differently. Now, a second use for commas is to join independent clauses. This is when basically you have two sentences that are closely related and you want to join them together. So if we were to say Taylor plays basketball, and then we also had another sentence, he enjoys running, we can easily join those two together. There's a couple ways to do that, but one of the ways is to use a comma and a conjunction. So we can say Taylor plays basketball, comma, and he enjoys running. The comma helps bring these two sentences together, and it helps you realize what's happening, that you're adding two sentences together. Now, the third use is to avoid confusion. There's a couple times when you want to do this. First would be when you're putting words in a list or items in a list. So if I were to say, I got a baseball, bike, and trampoline, I need commas to separate all three of the items. Now, sometimes you can leave the second comma off, and that can be fine as well. But you need at least one comma in here so people realize that it's a list. Because if I don't have a comma right here, it just looks like I got a baseball bike, and people are trying to figure out what is a baseball bike. Now, most people can pretty much figure out what you're trying to say, but a comma right there makes it so much easier for the reader because they can easily look at this and think, okay, you got a baseball, a bike, and a trampoline. Now, another time that you need a comma to avoid confusion is when someone just reading the sentence could easily get it mixed up, okay? So if I were to say, after we ate, our dad left for work, okay? So with the comma in here, it's easy to read that. After we ate, our dad went to work. The family was eating, they got finished, and the dad left for work, okay? But if the comma's not there, it can make it kind of confusing. The first time someone reads this, they're going to think, after we ate, our dad left for work. And so they're thinking, wait, they ate their dad? No, of course not. And a reader eventually, yes, is probably going to figure out what the person's trying to convey that wrote the sentence. But it makes it so much easier if you have a comma right here, because it makes it so much easier for the reader to understand what's going on. And sometimes, in certain cases, if a writer leaves out a comma, it can make it very hard, almost impossible, for the reader to try to understand what the writer was trying to convey. And as a writer, anytime you're writing something, you want to convey things in such a way that people can easily read them and pick up what you're trying to convey. All right, so then again, commas, three main uses: to separate clauses, to join independent clauses, and to avoid confusion. A complete predicate consists of both the verb of a sentence and the words around it, the words that modify the verb and complete its meaning. So in this sentence, he is the subject. And so I'm going to put one line under it. And ran is the verb of the sentence. So he ran a long way. So just a simple predicate would just be the verb right here, ran. But we're looking for a complete predicate here. So a complete predicate is going to be all the sentences that modify and further describe the verb. So ran a long way is the complete predicate in this sentence. Generally, all the words that come after the verb are going to be part of the predicate. So you see right here, the subject's right here, then the verb. So all these words past the verb is going to be part of the predicate. That's not always true, but generally you can determine the predicate that way. This next sentence says, the elderly mayor retired yesterday. So mayor is the subject, so I'll put one line under that word, and retired is the verb. So yesterday right here is also part of the predicate. So the complete predicate would be retired yesterday. Now the reason yesterday is part of the predicate is because I said that any words that modify the verb or further describe the verb are part of the predicate. Well, yesterday is what we call an adverb, which is a word that modifies the verb, because yesterday is telling when the mayor retired. So yesterday further explains the verb retired. So that's why yesterday is part of the predicate. So retired yesterday would be the complete predicate of that sentence. This last example says, I wrote a paper last night and turned it in this morning. Well, this sentence looks kind of complicated when determining the predicate, but it's actually pretty easy. I is the subject. Now the verb right here is going to be wrote. So the complete predicate is going to be wrote a paper last night. Now, and right here is what we call a conjunction because it joins two parts of a sentence together. But right after and, we see another verb, which is turned. Turned is a verb. So turned it in this morning is also going to be the complete predicate. So right here, we see a subject, two complete predicates joined together by a conjunction. So sometimes sentences are going to have two complete predicates. So the important thing to remember here is that a complete predicate consists of the verb and any words that modify or further explain the verb. When writing, it's important to have consistency in your use of punctuation. So you never want to alternate punctuation. So say you started a phrase with a comma, you wouldn't want to end it with a dash. Now it's also important to use these types of punctuation in pairs, like such as dashes, parentheses, or commas. You always want to use those in pairs because if a section of text has an opening dash, parentheses, or comma at the beginning of a phrase, then there should be a matching closing dash, parentheses, or comma at the end of the phrase. So we're going to take a look at some examples of the use of dashes, commas, and parentheses. So you always want to use parentheses in pairs. So here we see the sentence, after removing the fence, wear gloves, feed the pigs. So notice we have parentheses here and here. We wouldn't just use one by itself, or we wouldn't use parentheses here and a dash or a comma over here. The reason we have a comma here has nothing to do with the parentheses. It's just because we need to put a comma after this phrase, after removing the fence. So we always use parentheses in pairs. Now, we also always use dashes in pairs. Now, say we had two words like long-term projects. Here we would hyphenate long-term and put a hyphen right there. So a hyphen is different than a dash, but to us they often look the same and we kind of get them confused. So right, with a hyphen, you're just going to use it by itself there. But with a dash, you're always using it in pairs. But I just wanted to point that out so I didn't confuse you. So here we have the sentence, the two guys wearing hats, Brian and Andrew, play football. So we have a dash here, setting off Brian and Andrew, and then we have another dash to end it. And then with use of commas, sometimes we need to use them in pairs. As a general rule, we do use them in pairs. So like after the game we went to eat, notice we only have one comma. But let's go ahead and look at this sentence. My friend, the guy in the green shirt, plays baseball. And I need a period right there. So right here we see a comma, and we see another comma, because it's setting off this phrase right here. So we need two commas, because commas often set off certain phrases that don't have to be there, because we could just say, my friend plays baseball. But we use two commas here. Now the reason we only use one is because technically the other comma would go before after, because we could just say we went to eat, but we're adding in after the game. But it would be silly to put a comma at the beginning of a sentence. It works the same way if this sentence was reversed. If we said we went to eat after the game, we'd put a comma before after, and we just put a period after game instead of another comma. So usually you're going to use it in pairs, but there are exceptions. Then many times you use commas for items in a series, like I enjoy playing basketball, baseball, football, and soccer. I'd put a comma after all of those different sports. Well, in that case, I would only end up with 3 commas instead of 4. And so that's an odd number. So they're not always going to be used in pairs when you use them for items in a series. So again, make sure you don't alternate punctuation, and make sure that if you're using dashes, parentheses, or commas, that you have the punctuation to open up the phrase, and you have the punctuation there to also close the phrase. Dashes have two main functions. One, they can be used in place of commas in order to set off a certain part of the sentence. Or two, they can be used to show a pause in a quotation. So let's take a look at the first use. Two states on the West Coast, Washington and Oregon, have amazing weather. So right here, Washington and Oregon could be omitted from the sentence. So try reading the sentence without Washington and Oregon in the sentence. Two states on the West Coast have amazing weather. That sentence still makes perfect sense. So Washington and Oregon is just extra information. So what's one way you can set off additional information? Through the use of commas. So we could just put a comma right here after coast and a comma right here after Oregon. But in this case, the writer chose to use two dashes. So here, the sentence reads, two states on the West Coast, Washington and Oregon, have amazing weather. So here, you pause and where the dashes are. Just like you would pause when you see a comma, pause where the dashes are. So it's two states on the West Coast, Washington and Oregon, have amazing weather. So that's one way to use dashes, just to set a certain part off of the sentence from the rest of the sentence. Now also dashes can be used to show a pause in a quotation. Like right here, go to the left, turn right. So right here the speaker is telling the driver to go to the left, and then they pause for a second and realize that they actually need to go to the right, so they're saying turn right. So the dash right here is showing that the speaker thought for a minute, because otherwise the sentence wouldn't make sense without the dash, because the sentence would just read, go to the left, turn right. So the dash is needed here to show the reader that the speaker paused, thought about it, and then changed their mind. A dash can also be used at the end of the sentence if a speaker suddenly stops what they are saying. So it could be like, I was headed this way, then there's a dash, and then it could be Jim froze in fear when he saw the bear. So dashes can also be used at the end of a quotation. So just remember the two main ways that dashes can be used. Dashes aren't used very often, so use them sparingly and only when needed. Adjectives can take on different forms when they're being used to compare two or more things. Let's take a look at this example on the board. We have the word fast. That is an adjective in its most basic form. So if we were going to compare two things to each other, we would use the adjective faster. So an example of this adjective right here, fast, would be saying, look at that fast person. Now, if we were comparing two people, Jim and Steve, we would say Jim is faster than Steve. You wouldn't say Jim is fast than Steve. You would say Jim is faster than Steve, because you're comparing two people. So we're going to call this form of the adjective the comparative form. And you can do this with other adjectives besides fast. You could use tall and then taller, or pretty and then prettier. So we call this the comparative form, and the comparative form is generally found by adding er to the adjective. So this is fast right here in its basic form. Then we add er to it to make it faster, and it's in its comparative form to compare two people or two objects. So you could say that car is faster than the other one. Now, let's look at the word fastest. We changed fast into fastest by adding est. This is the superlative form of fast. The superlative form is used when you're comparing three or more objects or people. So you could say Jim is the fastest runner on his track team because there's many athletes on his track team and he's the fastest. Or you could say this is the fastest car that this dealership sells. It's used when you're comparing three or more things. So remember, that's called the superlative form. Now let's take a look at this played out in some sentences. So this first sentence says, she is a kind person. Kind is the adjective here because it's describing person. Now, if we want to look at the comparative form of kind, we would add er to it to get kinder. So when we're comparing her to her sister, we would use kinder. She is kinder than her sister, or she is a kinder person than her sister. And then in this last sentence, we would say she is the kindest person in her family. because there's 3 or more people in her family, and she's the most kind in all of her family. So we would say kindest because it's comparing 3 or more people. Now, like I said, to get the comparative form, you add ER to the adjective. And to get the superlative form, you add EST. Now, sometimes adjectives are not always that easy. There's some words which we call irregular pronouns. Take the word good, for example. Like, he is a good piano player. Now, if you say that he is gooder than he used to be, in other words, he's improved, you wouldn't say he is gooder than he used to be. That doesn't make sense. The next word would be better. He is better than he used to be. Or he is a better piano player than John. Now, if you wanted to say he is the bestest player he has ever been, that doesn't make sense either. You would say he is the best player that he has ever been, or he is the best player out of all of his brothers. So you see here that even in this comparative form and superlative form, even though this is kind of irregular, ER still exists in the comparative form like it does with the word faster, and EST still exists in the superlative form like it did in fastest. Now let's look at one more kind of funny word. We have the adjective happy. Now if we want to change this to the comparative form, we can't leave the Y. We have to change the Y to an I. So if we write it like that, it does make sense. Happier. And then the superlative form would be happiest. Because if you left this I right here as a Y, that wouldn't be grammatically correct. It needs to have an I right here instead of a Y. So the important thing to take from this session is that you have an adjective in its regular form, which then can be changed to the comparative form when comparing it between itself and one other thing. Like when you're comparing 2 people or 2 objects, you use the comparative form. And when you're comparing 3 or more people or objects, so if you're comparing 3 people to see who is the fastest, then you use the superlative form. Or if you're comparing 25 people to see who is the fastest, you still use the superlative form. Direct and indirect objects play important roles in sentences, so it's important that you can identify them. So first, let's take a look at direct objects. Direct objects are basically the receiver of the action of a sentence. So the verb is telling what's going on, and the direct object is telling who that action is occurring to. So take a look at this sentence to see what I mean. He sold his car. So the verb right here is sold. Okay, so what is being sold in this sentence? The car is being sold. So I'm going to write D-O above it, okay, because it's called a direct object. So D-O stands for direct object. He sold his car. That car is the direct object. Look at this sentence. He washed clothes. Washed is the verb. He is the subject. So what is he washing? He is washing clothes. The clothes are being washed. So again, I'm going to write D-O because that's the direct object. Now an indirect object is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's indirect. So right here in this sentence it says the man gave his wife a necklace. So the direct object here is a necklace because that's what's being given. Man is the subject, gave is the verb. So the man gave what? The man gave a necklace. So that's the direct object. But what about his wife? Now the man didn't give his wife, so wife can't be the direct object. But instead wife is the indirect object. Why? Because the wife is receiving the necklace from her husband. Look at this sentence. The sun gave my skin a sunburn. So what's the direct and indirect objects here? Well, the direct object can't be my skin because the sun isn't giving my skin. The sun is giving a sunburn. So sunburn is the direct object. So this indirect object here is skin. So I'm going to write I-O. Okay, because the sun is giving a sunburn. So you can ask the first question, what is the sun giving? The sun is giving a sunburn, so that's the direct object. And then you could ask the question, who is the sun giving a sunburn to? And the indirect object would be skin, because it's giving a sunburn to my skin. So the important thing to remember is the direct object is the action receiver in the sentence. And the indirect object is, like I said, it's indirect. Just keep asking questions, okay? The man gave. What did the man give? He gave a necklace. Who did he give the necklace to? His wife. An ellipsis is basically 3 dots. You may have not heard the word ellipsis before, but surely you've seen 3 dots used before in writing. So the main way that these 3 dots can be used is to show that something has been omitted from a quotation. So originally a speaker said, this is the time to act, this is the time to move, right now. Now the writer of this paper wanted to include that quotation. However, they wanted to make the sentence shorter and they didn't want to include the entire quotation. So they removed the part that says, this is the time to move, and put 3 dots in replace of that phrase that has been removed from the quotation. So that shows the reader that something has been removed from the sentence, and this is not exactly how the original speaker said the sentence. So sometimes 3 dots can take the place of a paragraph or a few sentences, or sometimes it just takes the place of a word or 2. So the important thing is not that you remember the term ellipsis, but just that 3 dots, when in a quotation, shows that something has been omitted from that quotation. The exclamation point is used to show strong emotion. It's important that writers only use the exclamation point sparingly, because if it's used too much, it loses its effect. So make sure it is only used when it is actually needed. So take a look at this sentence. Look at that sunrise. So basically here it depends on how the writer wants to convey this sentence. Or say this is a quotation, it depends on how the speaker said it. So if the speaker said, look at that sunrise, we would just put a period at the end. But if the speaker said, look at that sunrise, then we would put an exclamation point or an exclamation mark, as it is often called. Exclamation points can often be used after one word, like wow, look at that sunrise. So here the exclamation point is used twice because the speaker said it with lots of emotion. Now, if it's not a quotation, then it just depends on how you as the writer wants to convey a message. So if you want it to be very subtle, you just add a period to the end of the sentence. But if it's a strong point that you want to show the reader, then use an exclamation point to help that sentence stand out. But remember that many times an exclamation point is seen as being used to show that the speaker or the writer is yelling. So if you use lots of exclamation points, then the reader feels like the writer is always yelling at them. An exclamation point can often be used in place of a question mark. So, like, take a look at this sentence. What is going on? So here, generally, you would put a question mark because it's a question. But if the speaker said it like, what is going on, or the writer wants to convey that strong emotion, then you'd put an exclamation point in place of the question mark. So again, make sure that the exclamation point is used appropriately and not too often so that it does not lose its effect.
Fragments and run-on sentences. A fragment is an incomplete sentence or thought that cannot stand on its own. And it can't stand on its own and is incomplete because it's missing either a noun or a verb. So let's look at some examples of fragments. The beautiful, blooming daisies in my yard. Now this is a lot of information. The beautiful blooming daisies in my yard. But you have your noun, some adjectives to describe it, an article adjective, and then you've got a prepositional phrase that tells you where they are. But you're missing something. You're missing the verb. So this one is a fragment. So you can have a longer sentence or a longer fragment that looks like a sentence and still have it be a fragment because it's missing either the noun or the verb. So we had our noun, but we were missing our verb. So even though it looks long and looks like it could be a sentence, don't be fooled by the length of a fragment, because just because a phrase is long doesn't mean it's a complete sentence. Let's look at another example. Waited all day at my house for you. In this sentence, we have an action, waiting, so we've got our verb. All day at my house for you. Well, you see some pronouns in there, but there's no noun. There's no subject of this sentence, so you're missing a subject noun in this one. So it's still a fragment. You've got the verb part, you've got the predicate part of your sentence, but you don't have the subject part. So this is a fragment. It is not a complete sentence. So when you're looking for fragments, look for either a missing verb or missing noun, because if you're missing one of those, then your fragment cannot stand on its own and will not be a complete sentence. In your writing, you'll need to revise these, and often you can just add a little bit to a fragment to make it a complete sentence. The beautiful blooming daisies in my yard look so nice this time of year. Smell wonderful. Are going to win the contest. You can finish the sentence in any way. Waited all day at my house for you. You could say, we waited all day at my house for you. I waited. My mom and I waited. It's a little bit more limited what you could put at the beginning of this sentence because we've got my and you for pronouns down here, but you still have options and you could easily turn this fragment into a complete sentence. Now let's look at run-on sentences. A run-on sentence is a sentence that should be written as two sentences. It's too long. It contains too much information and is confusing to the reader. And if it's running on and on and on, then it's likely there's not correct punctuation and there's too many nouns and too many verbs crammed into one sentence. So you need to break it up so that you've got separate complete thoughts and it's easier for the reader to understand. Let's look at these examples of run-on sentences and then correct them. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. This is a lot of information, so we need to see where one thought ends and another one starts so that we can split it up. I couldn't believe it. Well, we want to know what she couldn't believe. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. So all that is one thought. So we're going to separate this and put a period, and we would need to capitalize the next letter, but since it was I, it was automatically capitalized. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. Now we have two complete sentences. They're separate, it's not too much information in each sentence, and it's not going to be confusing to the reader. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. So now, it's not so confusing. It doesn't just run on and on and on. We didn't have so many subjects and so many verbs in one sentence. Now we've separated it out and made it easier for the reader to understand right away. Let's look at our next example. John and Mary had so much fun they went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. Now this one, we need to find where we need to split it up. We have another run-on sentence. We've got a lot of actions, but we need to see where we could split it up to keep the subject and verb of one sentence and the subject and verb of a second sentence and make it 2 complete sentences. We don't want to split it up incorrectly and leave a fragment somewhere. John and Mary. Let's look at what they did. John and Mary had so much fun, they. When we get to they, that's a new pronoun. That's a new subject. So we should stop there. John and Mary had so much fun. And then, if we're starting a new sentence, we need to capitalize our T in they. John and Mary had so much fun. They went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. So now, we have 2 complete thoughts. First, we're saying they had fun, and then we're saying how they had fun. And we didn't keep it a run-on sentence to where we had this pronoun in the middle of this sentence, making it sound a little confusing. We have John and Mary having fun, and then they went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. So we split it up into 2 sentences that are easier to understand. And you also would want to revise any run-on sentences in your writing. If you see a sentence that's going on and on for 3 or 4 lines, you probably need to find somewhere in there to break it up so that it isn't a run-on sentence. You can have sentences that are more complex if you're using semicolons, etc., but you don't want it to be so long that there are too many ideas in one sentence. So when you're writing, make sure you don't have any incomplete thoughts that are missing a noun or verb. We don't want any fragments in your writing, and make sure that none of your sentences are going on so long and including too much information that it makes it a run-on sentence. Gerund, infinitive, and participle. These are all different forms of verbs. A gerund is a verb ending in ing that is used as a noun in a sentence. There are a lot of times when you'll see a noun that is actually a verb form. We admired the vocalist singing. In this sentence, they were admiring the vocalist singing. They were admiring something, which makes this a noun. But singing is also a verb, so this is a gerund because it is a verb used as a noun in this sentence. Running is my favorite hobby. Running is also a verb, but in this sentence, running is the noun. This is my favorite hobby, this thing. So running is a gerund in this sentence. Infinitive is a singular verb preceded by the word to, which is considered the base or unconjugated form of the word. So, let's look at some examples. She loves to sing. So this is the infinitive form of the verb sing. It isn't conjugated, it hasn't been changed to past tense, it hasn't had a suffix added to it yet. It's got the word to in front of it, so it is an infinitive. She loves to sing. I love to run. So if you see a verb that has the word to in front of it, it's a good chance that that's in the infinitive form of that verb. And participles are verbs that end in ing, like gerunds, and form the progressive tense of the verb. But participles are not used as nouns, so that's the difference between the gerund and the participle. A gerund is going to be used as a noun in this sentence. A participle is not. The sleeping baby is snoring. Sleeping is a participle. It has the ing ending, and it's used in the sentence that lets you know the baby is sleeping, but it doesn't say the baby is sleeping. The running motor sounds loud. Running is also a verb, but in this sentence it's got the ing and it isn't used as a verb. The running motor, it lets you know the motor is running, but it doesn't say the motor is running. The verb in this sentence is sounds. So running and sleeping act more as adjectives in this sentence. And not all participles are going to act as adjectives, but they are going to end in ing, and they're going to tell you what's going on with the noun in the sentence without actually behaving as the verb in that sentence. So whenever you're reading and you're trying to figure out parts of speech in certain sentences, look to see if you see gerunds, infinitives, or participles. Because if you know a word is a gerund, then you'll say, oh, I know this word is a verb that's used as a noun. Or if you see a noun being used as a verb, you can say, oh, this is a gerund. So knowing those things can help you finish diagramming the rest of the sentence. If you know that one word, even though it looks like a verb, is a noun, then you will be able to find your actual verb, such as is, which is a be verb and may not be as easy to identify since it isn't an action verb. So don't be confused by the fact that running is an action and is just this little be verb. Infinitives, make sure that you're watching for that clue word to. If you see to before a verb, then you're probably looking at the infinitive form. And participles, look for the ing ending where the verb is not being used as a verb in that sentence. It's being used as an adjective or some other word, and you actually have a different verb, and it's going to end in ing but not behave as a noun. So in diagramming sentences, it's going to be important that you can tell the difference between a noun and a verb and an adjective, and sometimes verbs look like other things. Even though it's going to look like a verb, it's going to behave like a noun or going to behave like an adjective. So just pay close attention because verbs are not always going to behave like verbs. Idiom. An idiom is a type of figurative language that has a meaning that's different from its literal meaning. It's used to add color to writing and make it more interesting. There are lots of idioms in the English language and even more worldwide that you could look up. Some of them may sound really funny to us, but a lot of them are based on old rituals or an old way of doing things, and they've kind of transitioned into newer days, but they have different meanings that aren't the same as the literal meaning anymore. Some examples would be kick the bucket. Well, a person isn't going to actually be kicking a bucket. It means they're going to die. If you said, oh, our old cow finally kicked the bucket, well, it just meant that the cow died. If you're bent out of shape, you're not actually bent a funny way. It means that you are upset or worried about something. If you hear something or hear from someone out of the blue, it's something that comes about unexpectedly. If you said something was a piece of cake, it would mean that it was easy. Easy to accomplish, as easy as eating a piece of cake. If you buy a lemon, it means you buy something that breaks immediately. A lot of times this refers to a vehicle, and so if you buy a used car and you think, oh, I got this great deal, and then it breaks within a few days or one of the parts breaks, then people say, oh, you really bought a lemon. But it could be anything. If you bought a sofa and you got it home and you had it for a couple days and you realized that one of the cushions was really stained or the middle of it was missing springs, and so you kind of sunk into it, then you might have bought a lemon in that way. But it basically means buying something that breaks immediately and wasn't quite what you thought it was. It turned out worse. And my last example is hit the hay. You're not actually hitting a bale of hay. It just means you're going to bed. So, idioms are figurative language. There's lots of different kinds of figurative language that you can use, but this is a fun way to add color to your writing. There are countless idioms, and most of them are commonly known. So if you use them in your writing, your reader will know what you mean, but they'll like that you tweaked it a little and made it a little more clever. You made it not just writing out the literal phrase. Especially if you're repeating a certain kind of topic or certain details several times, you may want to find different ways to say it, and sometimes an idiom can do that for you. Inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning starts with facts and details and moves to a general conclusion. So it lists different details, different examples, and moves to a general conclusion or helps you come to a certain conclusion. Now, inductive reasoning is probabilistic, which means that it's based on probability. You hear certain facts and you come to a conclusion, and that conclusion is going to have some level of probability to it. Now, these conclusions can be strong or weak, and they can be proved false. You could come up with a conclusion that doesn't actually happen. It's not something that's true. But based on the examples you were given or the facts you were given, the conclusion makes sense, even if it's not true. And that's how inductive reasoning works. So let's look at some examples. We have seen 30 white swans, therefore all swans are white. Well, based on the 30 examples that we've seen, this statement makes sense. This conclusion that we drew using inductive reasoning based on our 30 examples would make sense. But is it true? No, not all swans are white. You've got other colors. So this isn't a true thing. This is a false conclusion. But we did use inductive reasoning to get there, basing our conclusion on our examples. Let's look at the next one. Basketball players are tall. John is a basketball player. John must be tall. Well, we don't actually know John, so we're not sure about this one. It's very probable, so this one would be a stronger conclusion than our one about the white swans, but we don't know John. John could be short. John could just be really good at making goals. That doesn't mean that he is going to be a tall person. So it's probable, it's a stronger conclusion, but we don't know for sure. We just use inductive reasoning, knowing that basketball players are generally tall, and knowing that John is a basketball player, to figure out that John is probably tall. This is called bottom-up logic. We start at the bottom with our examples and we build on those facts, details, examples to come to a conclusion. So bottom up to the top to build our conclusion. Next, let's talk about deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning starts with a conclusion and then explains the facts, details, and examples that support it. So you start with one basic conclusion, one basic statement, and then give facts and details that can support it or that are examples of that statement. This one links premises with conclusions. So you come up with a certain premise and it's linked to your conclusion that you started with. If all premises are true and clear, then the conclusion must also be true. So you start with this one. All dogs are mammals. Okay. All mammals have hearts. Okay. So based on the fact that all dogs are mammals and all mammals have hearts, all dogs must have hearts. So you've got dogs are mammals and mammals have hearts, which means that dogs must have hearts since they are mammals and all mammals have hearts. This is a true conclusion, and that's because all the premises are true. So if all premises are true and clear, then the conclusion must also be true. So on this one, we have true, all dogs are mammals. True, all mammals have hearts. So it's true that all dogs must have hearts. And this one is a true conclusion based on deductive reasoning. Now let's look at example 2. All birds can fly. An ostrich is a bird. All ostriches can fly. So we use the fact that we know all birds can fly and an ostrich is a bird to tell us that an ostrich must be able to fly. So let's look at each of those statements. All birds can fly. Well, That one is false. There are actually about 40 different species of birds that can't fly or are called flightless birds. An ostrich is a bird. Well, that one's true. All ostriches can fly. That one is false. Ostriches are a species of flightless birds. So, since the first sentence was false, the second sentence, our conclusion ended up being false. And that may not always be the case, but whenever you don't have all your premises leading up to your conclusion true, your conclusion might not be true either. Now, we did use deductive reasoning to get there. So even though this is a false conclusion, we were basing it on the information we were given, on the conclusions that were given to us. We came up with this example of an ostrich, and it just wasn't correct. It wasn't true. So over here we had false conclusion, possibly false conclusion, true conclusion, and false conclusion. So using inductive and deductive reasoning is not going to be 100% accurate, but it is going to give you different ways to reason out information you have and try to make a conclusion based on one of these kind of logics. And deductive reasoning is also called top-down logic because you start with known conclusions and work your way to specific examples at the bottom. So you start at the top, known conclusion, work your way down to the bottom to specific examples. So whenever you are trying to figure out a problem or figure out how to connect information that you have, you can use inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, and just make sure that you are paying attention to whether you have facts and details to start with that you can base a conclusion on, or whether you've got broader conclusions that you're going to be coming up with examples for. And remember that they won't always be true. You might still have to go and research whether the conclusion you come up with is accurate or not. Inference. Inferences are conclusions that a reader makes using clues in the text. So an author may not explicitly say something, but they leave little hints behind, and you have to connect the dots to form a conclusion. And inference is different than making a guess because it is based on evidence. So you read, you pick up on those clues or hints that the author leaves behind, and you put them all together to form your inference. So let's look at a couple of examples. Charlotte's toddler is in bed asleep upstairs. She hears a loud thump and then loud crying. So knowing that the toddler is in bed asleep and then hearing a thump and crying, you can infer, or Charlotte can infer when she's at home, that her toddler fell out of bed. Now, our example doesn't say the toddler fell out of bed, and it doesn't say Charlotte ran upstairs and found her child on the floor, but because you know the kid was in a bed sleeping, and then you hear a thump, probably against the floor, and then crying, because the kid is hurt or scared from waking up in the middle of the night on the floor unexpectedly, Charlotte can infer that her toddler fell out of bed. Or the reader can infer that that's what happened whenever they're trying to process the story and figure out what the author was trying to tell them with these clues. So let's look at another example. Nolan sees cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth. So cookie crumbs on the floor, chocolate around his mouth is going to tell you that Nolan's son got into the cookie jar. And it may not be the cookie jar, it may be that he got into a pack of cookies, but you don't really know the rest of that. You just know that if there are cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth, that the kid got into cookies somehow. So you can infer he got into a cookie jar or a pack of cookies without the author explicitly saying that to you. And that's all it is. That's all inference is. Reading something and coming to a conclusion. A lot of the times it's really obvious things. If you see a lady come into a store and she's dripping wet and it's raining outside, you can infer that she doesn't have an umbrella. So some things are just common sense. They come to you. You don't even realize you're making an inference. But in the end, an inference is just a conclusion that a reader makes based on evidence. Interpretation of expository or literary text. Well, to determine what your interpretation of a work is going to be, first let's refresh ourselves on what expository and literary text are. Expository writing is going to be something that informs, explains, or describes. It's going to be very cut and dry. There's not a plot. It's basically there to explain something to you, tell you how to do something, give instructions. A science research paper would be an example. Baking instructions for baking a cake. Anything like that would be expository. So what you want to do is outline the basic elements of that paper, and then you want to evaluate their effectiveness. This is how you are going to give your interpretation. Once you outline the basic elements of the research paper or the recipe, then you can evaluate their effectiveness. Did you learn what you were supposed to learn from the research paper? Are you now able to bake a cake following those directions? Very cut and dry. Literary is a little bit different. Literary works are going to be your narratives, essays, works of fiction. These are going to have a plot. There's going to be more that you will have to go through, and because there will be so much more to the literary works, you want to focus on just one aspect to give your interpretation. You don't want to try to cover all of the elements because that would be too much and you wouldn't really get to put your personal interpretation on all of the different aspects of that work. So, some aspects you could choose from are the topic of the story, major characters in the story, major events, the setting, structure, point of view, use of language, or tone. Any of these would work. Pick one, focus on that one, and what you're going to do is explained here. An interpretation should both describe the text and elaborate upon it. So, say we were to choose major characters. You would want to describe what's in the text and elaborate upon it. And I've put that into a few steps here for you. So, to describe the text, introduce the major characters. In your interpretation, describe the major characters. What do they look like? What are their attitudes? How has the author described them in the text? Then, explain how the author portrays them. Are they liked by other characters? Are they meant to be a villain or a hero? Are they just an everyday Joe? How does the author portray these characters? And then discuss what the author's purpose was. Why did the author portray them that way? What did the author want to get across to readers? And because this is an interpretation, there are going to be several different answers. There's no one right answer because no one is going to know exactly what the author's purpose was. You're giving your interpretation, what you think the author meant. So you'll describe everything that the author put in the book about the characters, and then you'll elaborate upon what the author put in there by telling what you think the author was trying to tell, what the author's theme was, what their purpose was for showing characters in a certain light. So when you are interpreting a text, With expository, you want to remember to just outline the basic elements and evaluate their effectiveness. Were you able to bake that cake? Did you learn what you were supposed to from the research paper? With literary works, you want to focus on one aspect. Out of all the different things you could focus on in a literary text, pick one, just one, and then describe that one from the text, what the author actually said, and elaborate upon it. Go through and give your opinion on it, what you think the author meant. And the thing is, it's an interpretation. Everyone's is going to be a little different. Not everyone's going to pick the same aspect to focus on, and not everyone's going to elaborate upon it the same way. So since the author knew he was writing to lots of different readers whenever he or she created this work, try to make your interpretation unique.
There are certain words and titles that need to be italicized. When typing, these words would be in italics, but when writing it out by hand, these words just need to be underlined because it is too difficult to write words in italics by hand. So here are the words and titles that need to be italicized or underlined. The titles of books, the titles of poems, long poems, the ones that could be a book by themselves, speeches, particularly famous speeches, the titles of movies, the titles of TV shows, plays, long musical pieces, and magazines. Space shuttles, planes, and ships, like the name of a space shuttle, the name of a plane, or the name of a ship, all need to be in italics or underlined if written by hand. Some words need to be in italics if you want to place particular emphasis on that word. Like if someone was saying, "come here," they could underline that word or put it in italics. If a word is expressed as a word in a sentence, then it needs to be put in italics. Like if you spell basically wrong, the writer is not using the word basically to express anything in the sentence. They are actually talking about the word basically. So that's why it's underlined. Also, there are many foreign words that are part of the English language almost because they're used so frequently. But any foreign words or phrases that are not very familiar in the English language need to be underlined or placed in italics. Like in this case, edificio needs to be underlined. So those are the important things to remember when it comes to putting words in italics.
Italics and ellipses. Italics sets apart a word or phrase from surrounding words. It distinguishes a word or phrase. It's used for book titles, foreign words, names of vehicles, used for emphasis, and for words of words. And it's used for words only, not for punctuation. So if you have a phrase or a name of something in italics and it's at the end of the sentence, the words get italicized, but the period or exclamation point or question mark at the end of the sentence does not get italicized. So let's look at some examples to see how italics can distinguish a word in a sentence and set it apart from the rest of the sentence so that you really focus on that one word. I loved Black Beauty when I was 11. Black Beauty is the title of a book and it sets it apart, and you know that's what the title is because it's in italics and the rest of the sentence isn't. So you can easily distinguish what the title is from what else I wrote. I just got a feeling of deja vu, that feeling that something's happening that's already happened before. Deja vu is a foreign word or foreign phrase, and so it is put in italics to set it apart from the rest of the sentence. The Titanic. The Titanic is the name of a vehicle. This could be cars, it could be ships, it could be planes. Any vehicle, the name of it is going to get italicized. So Titanic gets italicized. He ate not 2, but 10 slices of pizza. 10 being italicized gives emphasis to the word. You notice how when I read it, I emphasized the word 10. He ate not 2, but 10 slices of pizza. You're emphasizing just how great the number of slices of pizza was that he ate. And lastly, italics can be used to set off words of words. I love the word italics. So whenever you're saying, let's look at the word italics, or Whenever writing the words through and through, T-H-R-O-U-G-H and T-H-R-E-W, you would want to make sure you were using them correctly in the sentence. Whenever you're talking about a word and you say the word or look at this word, then you want to italicize the word you're talking about. And these would be English words because you're already italicizing foreign words. So it's English words that are words of words. That's what that means. So when you see italics, pay special attention to them and see why those words are being italicized. Is it a book title, a foreign word, the name of a vehicle, or is the author trying to emphasize something specific? Or are they just pointing out a specific word that they like or wanting you to pay attention to a certain word that they're discussing? Next, we're going to talk about ellipses, which are 3 dots, just a little dot, 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 used in formal writing to show that words are missing. And a lot of times this is used to leave out part of a long quote. But if you're doing that when you're writing, if you're leaving out part of a long quote, be sure not to change meaning. If you leave out too much of the quote or you leave out an important part, then the meaning is not preserved. So you want to make sure that you're preserving the meaning of a quote or the meaning of a passage whenever you are inserting an ellipsis. So let's look at this example. This is a quote from Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. "I cannot help it. Reason has nothing to do with it. I love her against reason." Well, that's a longer quote, and if you're trying to make it fit in your paper and your paper can only be 500 words, then you could insert an ellipsis. Ellipsis is singular, ellipses is plural. So if we insert an ellipsis, you could just say, "I cannot help it. I love her against reason." Saying reason has nothing to do with it is kind of repetitive because you're already saying, "I love her against reason. I can't help it." So putting the ellipsis here takes the place of this phrase. It lets you know, or lets the reader know, that there were more words here in this quote, but you took them out because they didn't affect the meaning. So you still get the gist of what the quote was about without having extra words in there. So you cut out 7 words with just 3 little dots. So it can be very handy when using quotes in a paper. So in your writing, pay attention to what words are italicized, see what the author is trying to tell you with those italics, and pay attention to ellipses, what was left out. Make sure that if you are using ellipses in your paper, you do not take away the meaning of the quote.
A comma is there for the purpose of breaking the flow of text. So basically we could define the job of commas as to break the flow of text. So commas should come in places in sentences where we would naturally pause if we were speaking that sentence. And so one way to test whether or not a comma is necessary is to pause very deliberately at each comma when reading. Because it's important not to overuse commas because they lose their effect if they're used in places that they should not be. So it's important to know when commas are needed and when they're not needed, both for your own writing and maybe if you're revising someone else's work. So let's practice. Right here we have a sentence that says, "As you can see, the car is very old." But we have a comma right here. So if you're just reading this to yourself inside your head, you may have trouble determining whether or not the comma is needed. So try reading it out loud and deliberately stopping at the comma. "As you can see, the car is very old." Well, that makes sense because if you were speaking this, you would be explaining to someone and you would say, "As you can see, the car is very old." So the comma there is needed. Another example is this sentence right here. Natural disasters, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, are not very common here. So here we have 3 commas. We actually have 4 commas. And so 2 of these commas are there for the purpose of setting off this phrase, and the other 2 commas are there because we're making a list. So first, let's take a look at the phrase. Natural disasters, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, are not very common here. So really, we could omit everything in between these 2 commas and just say natural disasters are not very common here. So that's why we're using commas here, because we could set this off. But if you were speaking this, you would say natural disasters such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, are not very common here. So both of those commas are needed. Now, when you're reading the list, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, you don't really need to pause in between each item in the list. But here the commas aren't here as much to break the flow of text. In this case, they're just distinguishing between the different items in the list. So this is kind of an exception of when you wouldn't follow the rules of commas are only there to break the flow of text. But in general, hopefully you can see kind of a better idea of when to use commas. So where the check marks are, those were all the correct places to use commas, and then right there and right there as well. You just want to make sure that you use commas when you need them, and if in doubt, then generally leave the comma. But many times you want to leave out commas when you can because they slow down your writing, because someone feels like they need to mentally pause. If they're speaking, they need to actually pause when reading that comma. And so make sure your comma usage is appropriate. Misplaced modifiers can be very confusing, and they can distort the accurate meaning of your sentence. So let's look at this example up here on the board. The teacher said that eating fruit is good for you in class. This is a case of a misplaced modifier. Now, another word for an adverb is a modifier. So I'm going to write up here on the board adverb equals modifier. Modifier is the same thing as an adverb. So when we're saying a misplaced modifier, we're actually saying misplaced adverb. Okay, so you're looking at this sentence thinking, where is the adverb? In class, collectively, is the adverb. This is what you call an adverbial phrase. It's a group of words that collectively takes the form of an adverb, or collectively does the job of an adverb. So adverbs often answer a question. In this case, the question is, where? The teacher said that eating fruit is good for you. Where did the teacher say that? They said, in class. So in class answers the question where. So it's an adverbial phrase. Now, the reason this is misplaced, the reason this is a misplaced adverbial phrase, is because it appears to the reader that this phrase is modifying eating fruit is good for you. So it appears to the reader that the teacher is saying that to eat fruit in class is good. So it looks like the teacher is in favor of the students eating fruit while in the classroom. Now, that's not actually the case. The teacher is merely saying that eating fruit is good for you, but not while you were in class. So the better way to write this sentence would be, the teacher said in class that eating fruit is good for you. So in this case, in class is still the adverb, still the adverbial phrase, but since it's closer to what it's modifying, it makes more sense. So whenever you are writing, make sure that you put the adverb or the adverb clause or the adverbial phrase, whatever word or group of words that's modifying something in a sentence. Make sure that the modifier is very close to what it is modifying. Make sure the modifier is close to the modified. So right here, in class is the modifier, but it's modifying the teacher said, or it's modifying the verb said. But look how far away it is from the verb said. All these words are in between it and the word it's modifying. But when you put the adverb right next to the word that it's modifying, it makes it so much simpler for the reader to understand. Now the sentence can be read correctly and understood correctly. The teacher said in class that eating fruit is good for you. So remember, when you're writing, make sure that you don't misplace the modifier.
Multiple meaning words. Some words are spelled exactly the same, but they have different meanings in different contexts. So you have to look at context clues to figure out which version of the word you have in your sentence. One way you can do that is by looking to see if the word is a noun or a verb. The grammatical category that the word is can determine what the word means. And vice versa. If you aren't sure of the pronunciation, but you know which version of the word is being used, you can figure out what the part of speech is. So let's look at our first example. Trip. Trip can be a vacation, which is a noun, or it can mean to fall over something, which is a verb. So when we look at our sentences, she took a trip to Colorado. If you aren't careful, you might trip over that step. In this sentence, she took a trip to Colorado. She's taking a vacation. So you know this is a noun. Alternately, you could say, oh, a trip is a thing you might take, so it's a noun, so it has to mean vacation. If you aren't careful, you might trip over that step. This one is being used as a verb, so you know it means you might fall over that step. Alternately, you could say, you might trip over that step. Oh, in this sentence, trip is something you're doing, so it has to be a verb in this sentence. So either way, finding out if it's a noun or a verb can help you figure out which version of the word you're using in that sentence. Let's look at another example. Degree. Degree has at least 3 different meanings, and this one's a little trickier because they are all nouns. Unit of temperature is a noun. A title earned at graduation, if you earn a degree in astrophysics, that is a noun. Or the amount or extent of something is a noun. So finding the part of speech won't help you determine meaning with this particular example, but reading the sentence and using context clues can help you figure out which one we're talking about. He didn't notice when the temperature rose 1 degree. Okay, and this one, he didn't notice when the temperature rose 1 degree. You can look at temperature to know that this one is talking about a unit of temperature. So you're using your context clues to figure out the meaning of this word. Our next one, the business is only hiring someone with a degree. So are they hiring someone with a unit of temperature? Everyone has a temperature of something. Are they hiring only people that have earned a title through graduating? Or are they only hiring people with an amount or extent? And that one didn't really go any further, so it wouldn't be the amount or extent of something. So this one, if you sub in their title earned at graduation, this business is only hiring someone who is graduated. This one is going to have to do more with title at graduation. And then our last example, it was hard to tell the degree to which he really cared about the outcome. And this one, was it hard to tell the temperature to which he cared about the outcome, the title earned at graduation, or the amount or extent to which he really cared? And in this one, it's the amount or extent to which he cared. Maybe he didn't care that much about this, and so it was hard to tell, or maybe he was keeping his emotions inside, and so it was still hard to tell the degree to which he cared. So whenever you're finding words that could mean more than one thing, our special multiple meaning words, you want to look and see the context around the word. Look at the whole sentence to see what would make sense. And if you know multiple meanings of a word, try each definition that you know to see which one makes sense, so you're understanding the sentence correctly. Those multiple meaning words can be tricky.
Nouns can play different roles in different sentences. They can play the role of the subject of a sentence. They can take a possessive form, or they can play the role of an object in a sentence. So I want to look at those 3 different examples, 3 example sentences written up here on the board. Take a look at this first sentence. John has wisdom. So what's the subject in this sentence? The subject is John. and the verb is has. So right here, John is the subject of the sentence. Well, John is also a noun because a noun names a person, place, or thing. So John is obviously a person, and this is actually what we would call a proper noun because it names a specific person. So right here, John is a noun, and it's playing the role of a subject. So you can see here how a noun can play the role of a subject. Now look at this next sentence. John's wisdom can be helpful. What's the subject here? You may be tempted to say John's, but the subject is actually wisdom. So if the subject is wisdom, then what role is John's playing? Well, John's is the possessive form of John. It's describing the wisdom. It's saying that the wisdom belongs to John because it's John's wisdom. So here you see John's playing a possessive role in the sentence. Now look at this third sentence. The company hired John. Well, the subject of this sentence is company, and the verb is hired. So what role is John playing in this sentence? If it's not the subject and it's not in possessive form, so what role is it playing? Well, we would call John right here the object of the sentence. The object is what the subject of the sentence is acting on. So the company hired someone. Who did the company hire? The company hired John. The company is acting upon John. So that's how you find the object of a sentence. Now you notice that in this first sentence and in this third sentence, John is in the same form, just John. But when it plays the role of a possessive, then John has apostrophe S to it. So when a noun is playing the role of a subject and when a noun is playing the role of an object, it's going to look the same. But when it's in possessive form, you're going to have to change the word a little bit. Generally, you can just add apostrophe S, but there are some more complex rules when it comes to making some nouns possessive. So the important thing to remember, the thing you need to take away from this session, is that nouns can play three different roles. They can be the subject of a sentence, they can be in possessive form, or they can be the object of a sentence.
Persuasive texts and bias. Persuasive texts are written when the author wants to try to get the reader to believe or do something. So the first thing you can do is ask yourself, is the author trying to get me to believe or think or do something? And then go back to the text and find examples of the author being persuasive. And you may say to yourself, well, what kind of examples can I find? I feel like the author's trying to get me to say or believe or do something, but what kind of examples can I find? Well, you can look for persuasive language and persuasive techniques. Some examples of persuasive language would be saying something like obviously. Using adverbs like obviously you want to buy this product are strong adverbs that make you think, oh, it's very obvious. I should definitely do that. Another thing is pre-thinking. This is another persuasive language that you can use. And this is where the author may say, thank you in advance for doing this. Oh, thank you. We know we can count on your vote. Well, once you've been thanked, you feel more obligated to do something or act a certain way. So pre-thinking is some persuasive language. And one more example, though there are many, are money words. If you see, do you want to get rich fast? You can make thousands of dollars in just 5 minutes. Are you tired of being broke? Well, all those sentences or phrases included money words. And a lot of times those will draw people's interest and persuade you toward wanting to do or buy whatever that product is that is being advertised. Now, some persuasive techniques are glittering generalities, and this just means that words are being used that are positive words. They have a positive connotation, but they're very vague. So they're glittering, they're positive, but they're generalities, they're vague. It doesn't have any real meaning behind it. So if I said something was good or fair or the best, Well, if I don't have any evidence to back that up, then I'm just using a glittering generality. But hearing those kind of words like good and best, fair, those are words that have a positive connotation and start to persuade you that, oh, what I'm hearing about is a good thing. Another example of a persuasive technique would be bandwagon appeal. And this is where the author might say, oh, everyone's doing this. Well, if everyone's doing it, you need to jump on the bandwagon and do it too, because if everyone's doing it, you should want to as well. And again, there are lots more examples, but I'll give you one more example of persuasive technique, and that would be testimonials. You have a celebrity or some other famous person or a spokesperson for the product or just a satisfied customer telling you this product is good or this candidate is good, and they tell you about their personal experience with it, and that makes you more likely to want to buy it because you see real people telling you that this product or this idea is good. Now that you've seen about persuasive text, let's talk about bias, which is somewhat related to persuasion. When an author is not completely objective, they have a bias. That means that they obviously lean toward a certain perspective or side of an argument. So if it's very obvious that an author is leaning toward one side or another, then they probably have a bias. So pay close attention to see if both sides of the author's argument are presented evenly. If you see the author saying lots of positive things about one side of the argument and lots of negative things about the other side, then they have a positive bias toward the one thing and or a negative bias toward the other. So you can see how if someone has a bias, they would be trying to persuade you toward whatever side they were positively biased toward, or at least being persuasive in trying to get you not to do something. If they were negatively biased, if they were trying to get you to not go to a restaurant that they hated, well, they'd be biased against that restaurant. They'd have a negative bias, and they would try to convince you not to go. They may tell you good things about everywhere else and bad things just about that one restaurant. So, whenever you're looking at a text, you can ask yourself, is the author trying to get me to believe or do something? And if they are, there's a good chance that you're looking at a persuasive text. So look for examples of persuasive language and persuasive techniques to back up your idea that this is a persuasive text. And if you see that the author is leaning toward one side or another, then they're probably exemplifying some kind of a bias, whether positive or negative. Prefixes, suffixes, and root words. Have you ever been reading a book and come across a word that you've never seen before? Well, if you can break that word down into prefixes, suffixes, and root words, then you can probably figure out what the word means. For instance, orthography may be a word you've never seen before. But if we break it down into its prefix, ortho, its root word, graph, and its suffix, y, then we might be able to figure out what the word means. Ortho means correct or straight. Graph means write or draw. And Y means the state or condition of. So if we put all those together, we can get the state of being written correctly. And when we compare the definition we came up with our actual definition, you can see they're pretty close. The state of being written correctly, writing words using the proper letters. So you got a pretty good idea just by breaking the words down into a prefix, a root word, and a suffix and figuring out what those meant. And even if you only knew graph had something to do with writing, you would have an idea that orthography had to do something with writing. Let's look at another example. Geometric. We'll break down into our prefix, geo, our root word, metra, and our suffix, ic. Geo means earth, and we put that with metra, which means measure, and ic means having to do with. So, if we put all of those together, we can come up with having to do with measuring the earth. Now this one isn't quite as close to the actual definition, relating to the branch of mathematics that has to do with measuring points, lines, and angles, but it does have measuring in there. You would be able to tell from the root word measure that geometric is going to have something to do with measuring. So if you ever come across a word that you don't know, first try to figure out what the prefix is, the root word is, and the suffix is, so that you can maybe get an idea of what the word means. You can see how important prefixes, suffixes, and root words are to understanding what a word means.
There's something I like to call preposition overload, and that's when a writer or a speaker uses more prepositions than needed. Take a look at this first example. Where is Jim at? You notice right here that at is a preposition. However, this preposition actually is not needed. You don't believe me? Here, look, we can draw a line through at and try reading the sentence without the preposition. Where is Jim? See, the sentence still makes perfect sense without the preposition. Take a look at this next sentence. Where did Jim go to? We can again draw a line through that preposition right there too. And try reading the sentence without to. Where did Jim go? So a good way of determining whether a preposition in a sentence is needed or not is just by crossing out the preposition or reading the sentence without the preposition and seeing if the preposition still sounds grammatically correct. Take a look at this last example. It's not quite as obvious. He lives outside of the city. That sentence may sound perfectly fine, but actually try saying the sentence without the word of. He lives outside the city. The sentence still makes sense without this preposition. So again, even though this isn't very obvious, this is still a case of preposition overload. And as a writer, you don't want to use words that are not needed, because when you use more words than needed, it hinders the clarity of your writing. Quotation marks are used to show that the words inside the quotation marks are someone else's, not the writer's own. So look at this sentence. Come over here, Joe said. So the quotation marks right here and right here are conveying that the writer did not say come over here. Joe said come over here. So notice a few things about a sentence that has a quote in it. First, you open up the sentence with quotation marks. Then you capitalize the first letter of the first word inside the quotation marks. And then if you have a sentence that is declarative or imperative, any sentence that would end with a period if it was on its own, you end that sentence with a comma, then you have quotation marks, and then you say the rest of the sentence. So this sentence says, where did he go? Notice we open up with quotation marks, capitalize the W, but if where did he go stood by itself, it would have a question mark because it's a question. So we put a question mark right here and then close with the quotation marks. Notice that the question mark is included inside the quotation marks. It's not on the outside, it's on the inside. This sentence says, there he is, he exclaimed. So in this case, the person's saying it with a lot of emotion, so that's why we ended with an exclamation mark. Now these next couple sentences are kind of inverted from the sentences we've been looking at because the quote comes later in the sentence. So this sentence says, Michael said, I can't wait for dinner. So you put a comma after said, open up with quotation marks, go through the sentence, and then this sentence right here is declarative, so it ends with a period. And up here we ended with a comma, but here we're ending with a period because we've come to the end of the sentence, and there needs to be some kind of period or question mark or exclamation mark to end out the sentence. So in this case, a period is chosen to end the sentence, and then quotation marks are put at the end. Notice that the period is inside the quotation marks. This sentence says, Michael asked, what's for dinner? In this case, it's a question, so that's why we have a question mark at the end. Again, notice that it's inside the quotation marks. Now this final sentence is kind of unique. It says, I think we are having burgers. Michael said, do you know what we are having? So right here, there's two quotes within one sentence. So it says, I think we are having burgers. So we open up with quotation marks. We have the quote right here. We end with a comma because this is a declarative sentence. Then we have another set of quotation marks. Then we have something outside of the quotes because we're saying that Michael said this. And then we continue on with what Michael said. So we open up with quotation marks. And it says, do you know what we are having? This is a question, so we use a question mark. And then we end with quotation marks. So those are the important things you need to remember when using quotation marks. There are a couple of uses for the slash. So there is a forward slash and a backslash. But we're not worried about the backslash here. We're concerned about the forward slash. There's a couple of uses for the forward slash that I want to take a look at. I have some examples written up here on the board. This first one says, bring your notebook and or spiral. So notice there's a forward slash between and or. That's because the writer doesn't know which one will apply to the reader. So say the reader has a notebook and they also have a spiral, then the word and is more appropriate to the reader, the notebook and the spiral. But say there's another reader that just has a notebook or they just have a spiral, then the word or is more appropriate here because it would say bring your notebook or your spiral. So the writer is just putting and or in there because it just depends on the reader in that case. And so the writer is showing that either one is acceptable. It's acceptable if someone just brings a notebook or if someone just brings a spiral. And it's also acceptable if someone brings a notebook and a spiral. Forward slashes can also be used to separate the lines of a poem. Now this can only be used for short poems like, not poems that can make up a whole book, just short poems. And you put a forward slash in there to show that these are two different lines of a poem. So in a poem you'd have one line here, the air is filled with mist, and the next line would say, but I must insist. But in this case, we're just writing it in one line. So there's a forward slash to differentiate between the two lines of the poem. So that's a couple of uses for the forward slash. It's not that common in writing, so be hesitant when you use it and use it sparingly. A subject, along with a verb, completes a sentence. Every sentence must have a subject and a verb. So always be looking for the subject in a sentence because it has to be there somewhere. Look at this first example. Running is good for you. The verb right here is. So then what is the subject of this sentence? Well, the way you can find the subject is it's the person or thing that's doing the action in the sentence. So what is in this sentence? Running is. So running would be the subject. Okay, so think of another example, like he rode his bike. Okay, rode is the verb here. So again, you can just ask the question, who is riding here? Who is the person or the thing doing the action here? Well, the action is riding, so then who is riding? He is riding, so he would be the subject. Over here, she is cheerful. Okay, who is cheerful? She is cheerful, so she would be the subject. Now this is going to get a little bit more complicated now. She is cheerful, but her friend looks sad. So right here you see a verb, and then, okay, who is cheerful? She is cheerful. She is the one doing the action in the sentence, and that's being cheerful. So she is the subject. Now you look down here and you see another verb, looks. So what's the subject over here? Can there be two subjects in a sentence? There can. Because notice right here, but. But is what we call a conjunction because it joins two clauses together. So we have a sentence here and a sentence here, and but is joining them together to make them one. But if we have a sentence here and a sentence here being joined together by but, that means we must have two subjects and two verbs. So we found one subject and one verb, and then we found the other verb, so we're still looking for a subject. So what could the subject be? Could it be her looks sad? That wouldn't make sense, because remember, the subject is who or what is doing the action. So someone is looking sad in this sentence. Who is looking sad? The friend is looking sad, so friend is the subject over here. All right, like I said, every sentence has a subject and a verb, but you may come across some sentences like this. This sentence says, go to your room. So the verb here is go. So where is the subject in this sentence? Well, the subject is what we call an understood you. So we're going to put you in parentheses right there. So I say it's an understood you. Basically, it's understood that you is the subject of this sentence, so it doesn't even need to be included. So we could actually read this sentence as, you go to your room. But we don't always speak like that. Sometimes we leave the you out of the sentence, so we just have a verb. But nevertheless, there still is a subject. It's just not included in the sentence. Subject-verb agreement is essential to making sure that your writing makes sense. So let's look at some examples up here on the board so that you can better understand how to make your subject and your verb agree. See, the main problem that happens when subjects and verbs don't agree is that there's a certain number in the subject, but the verb doesn't agree with that number in the subject. See what I mean here? The flies are everywhere. See, flies is plural, and are is a plural verb as well. So that's why the subject and verb here are going together. So that's a great example of good subject-verb agreement. Now this sentence is talking about one fly. It says the fly is over here. So since fly is singular, the verb needs to be singular. Is a singular verb, so that's why it's used here. See, if we said the fly are over here, that wouldn't make sense. That's why we say the fly is over here. This next sentence says everything is in place. Words like everything or anyone are words that aren't very specific. So for the cases of subject-verb agreement, we consider words that aren't specific as being singular. So even though everything refers to many things, we still treat it as singular, so we use the singular verb is. This next sentence says people are here. So people is plural. That's talking about more than one person. So the verb needs to be plural as well. That's why we use the verb are. There are some sentences where you're going to have two subjects, and one subject may be plural and one subject may be singular. So the question arises, do I use a singular or plural verb? Well, the answer to that question is choose the verb or choose the word that is closest to the verb. So here we say my grandfather or my parents are going to buy a bike for me. So we would say are, because my parents is closest to are, and parents is plural, so we use the plural verb are. See, my grandfather is also a subject in this sentence. Grandfather and parents are both subjects. But grandfather is singular, so it doesn't necessarily agree with this plural verb. However, we have to choose either a singular verb or a plural verb, so it makes the most sense to base the verb off of the subject closest to it. So this sentence is the same sentence up here, just reversed. My parents or my grandfather is going to buy a bike for me. So here, we use the singular form of this verb, is, because grandfather is closest to the verb, and grandfather is singular. Parents, again, is still plural, but it's farther away from the verb than grandfather is. So the important thing is make sure your subject and verb agree in the number they are referring to, and that'll help you make your writing easier to understand on the reader's part. Subordinating conjunctions are words or group of words that make one part of the sentence dependent on the rest of the sentence. Take a look at what I mean. This sentence says the organization will exist as long as there is ample funding. As long as is the subordinating conjunction in this sentence. Now, the organization will exist could be a sentence by itself. You put a period right there. And there is ample funding could also be a sentence by itself. Those two sentences could stand alone. But when we add to this first sentence, the organization will exist as long as, it makes the rest of the sentence, or it makes that sentence dependent on something else. Because if we were just to say the organization will exist as long as, that leaves us hanging. That's a fragment. It needs some other words to go along with it to make it a complete sentence. So the organization will exist as long as there is ample funding. So as long as it's a subordinating conjunction, making the first part of the sentence dependent on something else to complete the sentence. Let's look at one more example. Since it is noon, let's eat lunch. Since right here is the subordinating conjunction. Remember, I said a subordinating conjunction can be one word or a group of words. So up here, it was 3 words. Sometimes the subordinating conjunction is 2 words, and then often it is just 1 word, like since. So here it says, since it is noon, let's eat lunch. Now again, let's eat lunch could be a sentence by itself, and it is noon could be a sentence by itself. But when we add since to it is noon, it makes this part of the sentence dependent on some other words to complete the sentence. Because if we just said since it is noon, that wouldn't make any sense. That would be a fragment because it's incomplete. So a subordinating conjunction makes the rest of the sentence dependent on something else to complete it. That way, since it is noon, let's eat lunch makes sense.
Textual evidence for predictions. A prediction is an educated guess about what will come later in a text. Now, your predictions can be about an event or about how a character will behave. But any prediction you make must be based on information in the text or based on knowledge about literature in general. For instance, if you've seen how a character has acted in a story so far, you can make a prediction about his future actions. And with your knowledge about literature, you know the basic layout of a mystery novel, so you might be able to predict who did something in a story or how the story is going to end up based on your general knowledge of literature. And the more you read, the more your general knowledge about literature is going to increase, so you may be able to make more predictions the more you read. Now, one specific way that you might find textual support for prediction is with foreshadowing. And foreshadowing is when the author hints at something that will occur later in the plot. So sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes the author doesn't say exactly what will happen. It may mention storm clouds on the horizon, and the storm clouds could equal danger or something bad happening. So if you have a character who is going through a tough time and then they see storm clouds on the horizon, or someone mentions a storm might be coming, then that may be the author's way of hinting that something bad is coming or danger is approaching. However, sometimes foreshadowing could be more direct, as in Romeo and Juliet. They talk about how they would rather die than live without one another. And that was William Shakespeare's way of hinting that in the end, when they thought that they might live without one another, they did end up killing themselves rather than live without the other one. Sometimes foreshadowing comes in the form of a fortune teller. There are a lot of stories that include a fortune teller or someone that happens to tell someone's fortune or tell their future even without being labeled a fortune teller. And they'll say exactly what's going to happen, and then later on, that's how the plot unfolds. Now, sometimes the author will throw in what's called a red herring. And that's when they tell you what's going to happen, but it doesn't really happen. So when a hint or prediction by the author does not actually happen. So, you have to pay attention because sometimes the author may give you a direct foreshadowing example. They may go and say exactly what's going to happen, and that'll be true. But sometimes they'll give a really big hint, or they'll even lay out the prediction with a fortune teller or by the characters just discussing how they feel like things are going to end up. but it's a red herring because that's not really how the author ends the story. So don't always think that if the author tells you something is going to happen, it's going to happen. But foreshadowing can often be a good textual support for any predictions you're going to make. So whenever you are making predictions while you're reading a story, make sure that your predictions are based on evidence either from the story itself, information in that text, or information that you've gained from reading other books and getting a general knowledge about literature. Textual support for interpretation. Whenever you're going to interpret a work, you are going to identify the author's methods, their tone, their use of language, their plot, major characters, setting. Then you're going to decide on one of those aspects of the writing, pick just one, and evaluate and analyze that one aspect. You want to give your opinion on what the author was trying to do with the use of this character or with the use of a certain tone. What was their purpose in doing that? But you want to make it stronger. And one way that you can make your evaluation, your interpretation of this work stronger is to root your interpretation in the text. That means you go through and you find specific examples in the text that support what your interpretation is. The examples from the text support your ideas. So it doesn't look like it's just things that you're coming up with out of your head. It's things that you came up with because of something specific in the story that made you think. So one thing you can look at is quotes. Look at what characters say. This could be something that affects the tone, or it could be something that reflects on a character, or it could be something specific letting you know what's happening in the plot. Look at details from this story. It could be how someone looks, so physical characteristics. It could be specific things that happen in the plot. It could have to do with the tone as well. It could have to do with specific language that the author used. But find those details and then put them into your evaluation. Find these quotes and put them into your interpretation. So if you're trying to describe how a character acts or how you felt about a character, go back and find something specific about that character in the story and put it into your interpretation so that your essay now has roots in the text and is going to be stronger. Another thing you can do, which isn't going to pull information directly from the text you read, but is going to make your work stronger, is to find statistics or facts relating to your topic. Now, this could be, if you're writing about cell phones, you might say, a lot of people use cell phones. Well, instead of using that general phrase, you could give an actual number of people who use cell phones. Or if it's people using cell phones while driving, or while at home, or while at work, or under or over a certain age, you could look up that statistic and put it into your paper. And it's going to help because it makes things more precise. It shows you did your research. It shows you aren't just making things up from your head. You are actually going out and finding this information somewhere. The same way that you giving your opinion of a character or of the theme of a work is based on the quotes that you find or details that you find in the writing. So whenever you are giving an interpretive essay, you want to find textual support for that interpretation. Identifying the author's methods, finding one aspect to focus on, and evaluating and analyzing that is all important, but to make it even stronger, you want to root your interpretation in the text. Theme. Theme is the overall idea of a piece of literature. So think about the lesson or moral of the story that the author is trying to get across to you. One thing to remember is do not confuse theme with plot. Plot is what the characters do. It's the action of the story. It does not have to do with the overall lesson or message that the author is getting across. Now, obviously, what the characters do is going to help you understand the theme, but plot and theme are not the same thing. Plot is going to be more about human nature, society, and life in general. There can also be more than one theme. The author may have one overall message, but there may be a few messages in there, or you may be able to find more than one theme besides the main controlling theme of the story. Some questions to ask yourself are, what is the lesson or message? And some common themes are, man struggles against society, man struggles against nature, overcoming adversity, the importance of family and friendship, man struggles with faith, sacrifices bring rewards, and honesty is the best policy. So for all of these, I want us to look at the story of the tortoise and the hare from Aesop's Fables. And this shows you that there can definitely be more than one theme for one story. Now, all of these may not be what Aesop had in mind when he was coming up with this fable, but I was able to see all of these themes in the story. The last one, I couldn't come up with something for, but I've got a good one for that as well. So, man struggles against society. You've got this tortoise who feels like he's going to keep going and he's going to try to win the race, but all of society is against him and saying, oh, that hare has got you beat. He's way faster than you. I don't know why you think you're fast enough to beat him. So I'm sure that tortoise was struggling against society's views of him. Another one would be man struggle against nature. The tortoise is struggling against the nature of his self, how he's made. He's obviously not going to be as fast as the hare. He's going to have to go up hills. He's going to be fighting against the very nature of his self, where the hare is made to go much faster. Overcoming adversity. Just simply winning the race, the tortoise ended up winning even though no one expected him to do it. Even though people were probably telling him, oh, you can't do that. The hare's always going to beat you. The importance of family and friendship. Now, I've talked a lot about society, telling the tortoise he couldn't do this, but I'd like to think that the tortoise had some family and friends on his side that were urging him on, that helped him feel like he could actually go through and win this race. Man struggles with faith. The tortoise had to have faith in himself. The hare was very, very cocky. He felt like he had this race won, so much so that he went and took a nap, where the tortoise didn't do that. He had faith in himself and knew that he could do this if he just kept going, if he gave it his all. And then sacrifices bring rewards. The tortoise sacrificed that nap that the hare took, and in the end he won the race because he just kept going. Now, the moral of the story they give you is slow and steady wins the race, but I can see all of these themes in that story. Now, honesty is the best policy. I couldn't really come up with one for, but you can always look at Pinocchio. Pinocchio, every time he told a lie, his nose grew. It was not a good thing. Every time he lied, something bad happened to him. I won't ruin the whole story for you, but everyone knows about the growing nose, which is a sad punishment for someone who is not using honesty. So it's showing you honesty is the best policy. So whenever you're reading a story, you can look at what the characters are doing to figure out what the plot is, but remember the theme is different. The theme is going to be the controlling idea in that piece of literature. And you want to ask yourself, what is the lesson or moral the author is trying to get across to me?
Sometimes choosing the correct pronoun can be difficult. Consider this sentence. Ron and blank left. So here, you either need to insert the pronoun Ron and I left or Ron and me left. So how do you choose the correct one? Well, I'll go ahead and tell you that the correct response is I. the sentence should read, Ron and I left. Now, there is a grammatical way to come to that conclusion, but there's an easy trick to figure it out. Try removing the first noun in the sentence. So if we remove Ron and then we just read the sentence like this, it's much more easy to figure out which pronoun to use. We can read the sentence two ways. We can try I left, or we can say me left. Me left obviously is not grammatically correct. So the correct pronoun here must be I left. So then that means we can plug I into the sentence, and the sentence makes sense, like Ron and I left. All right, let's look at another option, or another example. He gave Ron and blank a gift. He gave Ron and blank a gift. So here, do we insert the pronoun I or me? Well, let's try the trick again and remove Ron and from the sentence. So we can try it two ways. Once by inserting the pronoun I, and once by inserting the pronoun me. He gave me a gift. Or we could read it as, he gave I a gift. Here, I does not sound grammatically correct. So me must be the correct response, because he gave me a gift sounds grammatically correct. So me is the correct pronoun to insert in the blank. So the sentence now reads, he gave Ron and me a gift. And that is the correct way to do it. So again, the more you get familiar with these pronouns, the easier it will be to determine which pronoun to use. But you can always use the trick of eliminating one of the nouns in the sentence to figure out which pronoun you need. Notice one more thing, that I always put the pronouns second, because in this case, these sentences were referring to the speaker. So say these sentences are referring to myself. Out of respect for the other person, you should always put yourself last in the order of people. So it wouldn't be correct to say, I and Ron left, or he gave me and Ron a gift. It always is grammatically correct to put yourself after the other people in the sentence. Verbals are words that look like verbs but are not playing the role of a verb. Take a look at this example sentence. The smell of the flowers reached my nose. What is the subject of this sentence? Well, our first impulse would be to say that flowers is the subject because it's right next to the verb reached. In fact, I'll underline reached twice because it's a verb. But flowers is not the subject of the sentence because the flowers don't reach my nose. The smell reaches my nose. And this may confuse you because you think smell is a verb. But in this case, smell is actually a noun, and it's playing the role of the subject of the sentence in this case. Now think of another sentence, like I smell cake. In this case, I is the subject, and smell is the verb. So the word smell can play different roles. In this sentence, it's playing the role of a verb. But in this sentence, it's a verbal, and it's playing the role of a noun and as the subject of this sentence. Look at another example. Swimming is enjoyable. Here the verb is, and the subject of the sentence is swimming, but swimming could also be the verb of a sentence. But in this case, it's a verbal, so it's playing the role of a subject. Verbals can also be the object of a preposition, like this sentence, I am not pleased about going. So I is the subject, and am and pleased is the verb, about is a preposition, and going is the object of the preposition. So I is the subject, am and pleased are the verbs. So then what is going if going is not a verb? Well, about is a preposition, and every prepositional phrase and every preposition has an object of the preposition. So going is the object of the preposition. Why is it the object of the preposition? Because it further explains the preposition. Now look at this sentence. I hate taking my medicine. I is the subject, and hate is the verb. Now, the temptation here is to think that taking is the verb, or that hate taking collectively is the verb phrase. But hate is the only verb here. Taking can sometimes play the role of a verb, but in this case, it's a verbal, and so it's the object of the verb. That's the role taking's play. That's the role that taking is right there. It's the object of the verb. All right, last example. Listen to the soothing music. Listen's the verb. So soothing is not the verb. So what is soothing doing right here? Well, soothing is describing the music because it's telling you more about the music. It's describing the music. It's telling you that the music is soothing. So what is music? Well, music right here is just a noun. So soothing is describing music, and any word that describes a noun is an adjective. So here, soothing is playing the role of an adjective. So remember, a verbal is just a word that looks like a verb, but is playing a different role in the sentence. Understanding verb tenses is critical because verb tenses are used to show when a verb took place. So if you use the wrong verb, it makes your writing very confusing. So I'm going to look at 4 verb tenses. I have them written up here on the board. First one is the past tense. Then we have the present tense, the future tense, and the past participle tense. So I want to look at 2 verbs and see what they would look like in the different tenses. So first we have the past tense. Think about the verb walk. What would be the past tense of the verb walk? It would be walked. So even if I didn't have all this other stuff about verb tenses written up here on the board, and we just had the verb walked, anyone could look at that and know that that means that that happened in the past. He walked down the street. That verb right there is indicating that he walked in the past. All right, let's look at the present tense of the verb walked. It would be the verb walks. Now, present tense means that whatever is happening is occurring now. Now, it doesn't always mean that it's happening right now. So, like, think about the verb walks. If we say he walks to school, that doesn't necessarily mean that he is walking on the road right now headed to school. It just means that every day, currently, he walks to school. Let's look at the future tense. It will be will walk. That's the future tense of the verb walk. He will walk down the street. Again, you can just look at will walk and know that means something will happen in the future. Past participle is used to show that something happened in the past before something else happened. So it's going to be similar to the past tense, but just a little bit different. We're actually going to add what's called an auxiliary verb or a helping verb, which is the verb has. So we're going to say has walked. So up here, we would just say he walked down the street. Now we're saying he has walked down the street. It's showing that that happened in the past before something else happened. Now let's look at one more verb. How about the verb do? So the past would be did, as in he did that. The present tense would be does, as in he does that. The future tense will be will do. He will do that. And the past participle would be has done, as in he has done that. So again, it's critical that you understand verb tenses and that you apply what you know about verb tenses to use the correct verb tense in all of your writing. What is a predicate? Well, a predicate, along with the subject of a sentence, makes a sentence whole. The subject of a sentence tells who is going to do the action of the sentence, and then the predicate tells what that action is going to be. Take a look at this first sentence. The friends hike frequently. The subject of this sentence is friends. So what is the verb of this sentence? Well, since the subject tells us who is going to do the action, and the predicate tells us what that action is going to be, then it only makes sense that the verb here needs to be what the friends will be doing. Well, the friends here will be hiking. So hike is the verb. I'm going to put 2 lines under it to show that it's the verb. So here, friends is the subject. So friends is going to be the people doing the action in this sentence. And then the predicate tells what that action is going to be. This next sentence says, the friends have been hiking. Here again, friends is the subject. So what is the verb here? Well, you look at hiking right here, you know that's a verb. Well, have and been are also verbs as well. Have and been are what we call helping verbs because they're helping hiking right here. So friends says, or the subject here tells that friends is going to be doing the action of this sentence, and the predicate tells what that action is going to be. All right, this third sentence says the friends hike and camp. Friends again is the subject, so friends are going to be the people doing the action in this sentence. Well, what's the predicate here? Well, you know hike is a verb, but camp is also a verb. So here you have two verbs because the friends are going to be doing more than one thing. So remember, when looking at a predicate, just remember that a predicate is what completes the sentence. The subject tells who or what is going to be doing the action, and the predicate tells what that action is. A preposition is basically a word that can't stand alone because it wouldn't make sense by itself. Some examples of a preposition would be in, under, or around. You notice these words can't stand by themselves because they don't make sense by themselves. There's not enough information there. So that's where the prepositional phrase comes into play. A prepositional phrase might look like in the tree or around the corner. So right here, in would be a preposition, and tree is what we call the object of the preposition. Because right here, if we just have the preposition in, we're wondering in what? It's in the tree. Or around the corner. Around is a preposition, and corner is the object of the preposition. We don't know what's around. It's around the corner. So prepositional phrases just come in sentences, oftentimes at the end of a sentence. So we could say, the squirrel is in the tree. Here again, in is the preposition, tree is the object of the preposition, and squirrel is the subject of the sentence. So if we just have the preposition, this kind of leaves us hanging. We're wondering the squirrel is in what? So tree is the object of the preposition because it tells where the squirrel, or what the squirrel is in. So there's lots of prepositions out there, way too many for me to name right now. But I'm going to teach you a trick to help you remember prepositions. All right, there's a tree I drew. That's about the best I can do. But think about a tree and a squirrel. Okay, think about all the things the squirrel can do when near a tree. And that'll help you remember prepositions. Because a squirrel could be under a tree, and under is a preposition. It could be in a tree, or around a tree, or upon a tree, or behind a tree, beside a tree, next to a tree, beneath a tree, over a tree, toward a tree, past a tree, or by a tree. So all those words I listed, by, past, toward, those are all prepositions. And so by remembering a squirrel and its relationship to a tree, it may seem kind of silly, but that can help you remember many of the prepositions. There is a progression in the spelling of a compound. Many times it starts out as two words, becomes joined with a hyphen, and then becomes one word. Therefore, it is very important to consult a recent dictionary or online resource to determine how a compound should be spelled. Now remember that just because you join a compound with a hyphen in one instance doesn't mean you will always use a hyphen to join that compound. So it's important to evaluate a compound on a case-by-case basis to determine if the use of a hyphen is necessary. So I'm going to break down for you some of the most common instances when you should use hyphens. You should use a hyphen to join a compound when it is a compound adjective directly before the noun it describes. Here's a prime example. He wore a mud-stained shirt. So here mud-stained is a compound adjective right before the noun it describes, which is shirt. If I were to say to you his shirt is mud-stained, it would not need a hyphen. Mud-stained would still be an adjective describing the shirt, but it would come after the noun it describes, not before. Then you also use hyphens to describe family relationships, such as brother-in-law, father-in-law, or mother-in-law. And then you use a hyphen when spelling out numbers. If you're spelling out a number anywhere from 21 to 99, you need to spell it out and use a hyphen. Now, once you get to a number above 99, such as 100, you still need to spell it out, but you don't need a hyphen. And then from there, if you're spelling out a number that would require you to use 3 words to spell it, then you just write out the digits that make up the number, such as 102. Now here we have 2 examples of the use of 2/3. Only 2/3 of the assembly were present. The proposition passed by a 2/3 majority. So you'll probably notice that here no hyphen is used, and here a hyphen is used. Well, in this case, 2/3 is an adjective. And remember that a compound adjective directly before the noun it describes needs to have a hyphen. So this is a compound adjective directly before the noun it describes. So it needs to be hyphenated. Now here you may be thinking that 2/3 is modifying assembly. But assembly is actually an object of a preposition. See, of is the preposition, and assembly is the object of the preposition. So really, you could just take the prepositional phrase out of the sentence, and it would read like this. Only 2/3 were present. Well, here, it's quite obvious that 2/3 is the noun of the sentence. So since it's a noun, not an adjective, it does not need a hyphen. So remember earlier I said you need to determine, or you need to evaluate a compound on a case-by-case basis to determine if the use of a hyphen is necessary. This is a great example of that. Here we have the same compound in both sentences, but since they're used in different ways, one needs a hyphen and the other doesn't. You also need hyphens when you have a compound that includes the word self. Now, there are some exceptions to this, such as selfless, which does not need a hyphen. When you use ex or pro before a word, you need a hyphen. Whenever you are writing out a sentence and the last word of the sentence won't quite make it on that line and you have to continue on the next line, it's appropriate to break up the word. However, you need to break it up between syllables. So giraffe, for example, has 2 syllables. So you couldn't just put a hyphen wherever you please, maybe after the R or the A. It has to be between the I and the R because you can't do a break in between a syllable. Now, if this doesn't work for you and it won't fit this way, then you can just leave an extra big space on that line and write the entire word on the next line. Also, you use a hyphen to avoid confusions with the spelling of a word. So here you have the word integral and you want to add semi to it. Well, if you didn't have a hyphen here, the I's would be next to each other, which would create some confusion as to how to pronounce the word. So by putting a hyphen, it really clears things up. But there are some exceptions to this, such as coordinate. Most people don't even think of coordinate as a compound, but really this could be written with a hyphen between the 2 O's. But now this word is so commonplace that a hyphen is no longer needed. ACT English sentence structure. Linking verbs do not express action. Instead, linking verbs express a state of being. So you have action verbs and linking verbs. And so linking verbs are reserved for expressing a state of being. So an example is, John was a doctor. Was here is a linking verb, and it's expressing a state of being, John being a doctor. And then the grapefruit here is too sour. The grapefruit is too sour. So is the linking verb here, and again it's expressing a state of being because it's describing grapefruit. So in addition to was and is, some other linking verbs are am, are, were, be, being, and been. Now, a noun or an adjective is going to follow a linking verb. So when an adjective follows a linking verb, it describes the subject. So an example is, this fruit is mushy. So we already know that is a linking verb. And so we look at the word following the linking verb, and we know it has to be a noun or an adjective. And we know that mushy is an adjective, and so it must be describing the subject. And sure enough, mushy is describing the subject, which is fruit. Now, when a noun follows a linking verb, it renames the subject. So here we have he is a doctor. Again, the linking verb is, and so the word following it is doctor. And so we know that doctor is a noun, so it must be renaming the subject. And sure enough it is, because doctor and he are interchangeable here because they're referring to the same person. Now, some sense-related verbs can also act as linking verbs, such as feel, look, smell, sound, and taste. And then there's some other verbs in general that can sometimes act as linking verbs, like appear, become, grow, and seem. And so we have some verbs that can be either an action verb or a linking verb depending on their meaning in a sentence. Some examples are appear, become, feel, grow, look, smell, sound, and taste. So right here we're using the verb grew. So here is an example of it as a linking verb. Mary grew ill. And so a linking verb is going to have a noun or an adjective following it. So here we have ill, which is an adjective. And so since it's an adjective, it must be describing the subject. And sure enough it is. It's describing Mary. It's saying that Mary is ill. Now here we have an action verb. We grew tomatoes. It's the same word, but this time it's acting as an action verb. Now pretend for a second that it is a linking verb. We look at the word tomatoes and we see that it's a noun, so it must be renaming the subject. Well, we and tomatoes aren't interchangeable because we and tomatoes are not the same thing. So we know that grew here must be an action verb. So you just have to base it off the context of a sentence when you're trying to decide whether a verb is acting as a linking verb or an action verb. But when you come up to these words up here, these verbs are always going to be linking verbs. But when you come to sense-related verbs as well as some other verbs, they can act as a linking or action verb. ACT, English sentence structure. There are three verb tenses that I want to take a look at. And those verb tenses are present perfect, past perfect, and future perfect. So the present perfect is used to emphasize the completion of an action in the very recent past. So here's an example. I have just purchased a necklace. So this is something that was completed in the very recent past. It was just completed. Person just purchased a necklace. Now, the present perfect can also be used to indicate an action begun in the past and continued to the present moment. So here's an example of that. Sam has lived in the same house for 10 years. So this is talking about something that is happening now and may have happened for a long time, but the reason we're still calling it the present perfect is because it's coming up all the way till the present. And then we have the past perfect, which indicates how two finished actions are related in time. So the example here is before he went blind, Milton had written Paradise Lost. So we're looking at two actions here, Milton going blind and Milton writing Paradise Lost. Both of these are finished actions. And so this sentence is showing that Milton wrote Paradise Lost before he went blind. So here, the first completed action is using the past perfect, while the second action is using the simple past. And then we come to future perfect, which indicates an action to be finished before a future time. So the example for that is, I will have finished the book before I take the exam. So this is an action that has not happened yet, but is going to eventually be finished. And the sentence is telling the reader before what event that action is going to be completed. See, the writer is saying they're going to finish the book before the event of taking the exam. So that's a look at present perfect, past perfect, and future perfect verb tenses. Noticing an author's position is very vital to understanding a piece of writing, because every writer is going to have a personal bias, or they're going to have a certain position on whatever they're writing about. So the way they portray something in their writing may not be totally accurate. So it's vital that you as a reader understand the author's position so that you can better understand their work of writing. So first of all, the author's position is basically their stance on the issue at hand. It's what they believe about the issue they are writing about. So to help you find the author's position, you need to notice several things. Notice each point here starts with the word notice, because to find the author's position, you can't just sit back and have it come to you. You as the reader are going to have to be proactive and notice these things. So first of all, notice personal opinions. So this is basically noticing when someone is interjecting their own thoughts about something instead of actually putting fact in there. Notice bias. This is when someone words a sentence or a paragraph so that they portray something as being good or maybe portray something else as being bad. In other words, they're not giving fact anymore. The way they word something casts something into a negative light or makes something look very good or very positive. Also, notice emotional language. This is when a writer puts their own thoughts into something or their own opinions into something, and then by using strong emotional language, tries to sway the reader over to their thinking. Now remember, again, we're not talking about a persuasive paper, because persuasive papers are always going to have a certain author's position in it, because that's the idea of a persuasive paper, that the author is trying to sway you a certain way. So we're not focusing on persuasive papers, focusing on other kinds of papers when the author really isn't supposed to have a bias, when they're not supposed to have a position on the issue. But nevertheless, they are going to have a position. And so sometimes they'll insert emotional language to try to persuade someone to their thinking. Then also, notice what information is left out. Because when we're talking about personal opinions, bias, and emotional language, these are all things that are going to be added to the paper. This is something an author may add to the paper to insert their bias or to insert their own position. But noticing what is left out is when the author doesn't write something to support their position. This may be some fact that would look bad upon their own position, so they just leave it out. So sometimes it's hard to know what is left out because it's not there. And if you don't know anything else about the topic at hand, you may not know what pertinent information is being left out. But sometimes that can be helpful to understanding the author's position. So the important thing to take away from this is that the author's position is their stance on the issue at hand. In any piece of writing that is out there, the author who wrote it is going to have a position on that subject. So it's up to you as the reader to determine how strong that position is portrayed in the paper, and to notice anytime anything is skewed or the facts are twisted a little bit, and when the author is trying to persuade you to believe like they do. You, as the reader, should always be drawing conclusions. So I'm going to write that point up here on the board. Always be drawing conclusions. In many cases, the conclusion of a writing will not be stated directly, and you will have to infer it from the information you already know and the information you are gathering from the text. So those situations are very difficult, and it's vital that you are always drawing conclusions because you never know when the right time to draw that conclusion will be. In this case, we're talking about conclusions that are stated directly, and these are much easier to find. However, you don't know where in the paper you are going to find this conclusion that is stated directly. Read this sentence. It is always more comfortable to draw conclusions from information stated within a passage rather than to draw them from mere implications. So when we're talking about drawing them from mere implications, that's called inferring. Now, when you're able to draw conclusions from information stated within a passage, that's talking about when a conclusion is stated directly. So these kinds of passages are pretty easy because the information is going to be stated directly. The important thing here is that you read the entire passage. Even though the conclusion is stated directly, you still have to find it. And sometimes there may be another sentence in the passage that looks like the conclusion, and so you may see that sentence and think, okay, this is the conclusion, I found it. But then right after that sentence, the author will then be offering a rebuttal to that proposed conclusion, shutting it down and giving a counter-argument, leading up to the author revealing the best conclusion. So it's important that you read the entire passage so that you can be sure that the conclusion you find is the same one the author intended for you to find. When defining words found in a text, often words have a definition that is more than the dictionary definition. So we can say that words have two definitions, a denotative meaning and a connotative meaning. The denotative meaning is the literal meaning of the word. So basically, if you're wondering what the word meant and it's the denotative meaning, then you could just look up the word in the dictionary, and the dictionary definition would describe the meaning of that word. However, the connotative meaning of the word also involves the emotional reaction a word may invoke. It depends on the reader's associations they may make with that word. So it goes further than the denotative meaning. And so denotative meanings are generally used in nonfiction works. Whenever in a nonfiction work the writer isn't trying to be flowery or use figurative language, so the actual definition of the word is what the word means in that context. However, in fiction works, the connotative meaning of a word also is often meant. So it's important that readers learn to differentiate between when the connotative or denotative word or denotative meaning is being used. And so the reader can usually determine by the context clues whether the author is using the denotative or connotative meaning of a word. Every piece of writing should have a logical conclusion, and it's your job as the reader to identify that conclusion, mainly for the purpose of helping you to understand whether you agree with the writer or not. Because you don't want to just read a piece of literature, you want to analyze it. So one step in that process to better understanding it is identifying the conclusion to know whether you agree with the writer or not. So now I want to talk about how to identify that conclusion. So you're going to need to infer a lot, or make an inference. And to infer something just means to take what you already know and combine it with something else to draw a conclusion. So it's pretty self-explanatory. And so what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to combine two things. What you already know with the info or the information found in the text. So I'm going to draw a double arrow there because to make an inference, you're pulling these two things together, everything you find in the text, any pre-knowledge you have, and you're pulling that together to draw the conclusion. And generally, a conclusion should be obvious. If a writer does a good job in their writing, then the conclusion should be easily identifiable. Otherwise, you may draw a conclusion that is not the conclusion the writer had in mind. But nevertheless, it's important that you as the reader analyze the writing and identify the logical conclusion. A prediction is a guess about what will happen next. So when a reader actively engages in whatever they are reading, they naturally make predictions about what will happen next. And they base these predictions off of what they have read, and what they already know. So by taking what they have read and what they already know, a reader can formulate what they think will happen next in the story. So consider this sentence. Staring at the computer screen in shock, Kim blindly reached over for the brimming glass of water on the shelf to her side. So the reader is naturally going to read this and have an idea of what is going to happen next. And the reader will probably notice the word blindly. So Kim is so caught up in what's happening on the computer, she goes for a drink of water, but since she's caught up on what's going on the computer, she reaches over without really looking at the glass of water to grab it. So the reader is going to assume that she's going to knock over the glass of water. Now, that may not be what happens, but still it's a prediction either way. The prediction may come true, and a prediction may not come true. But a reader is naturally going to make predictions about a passage, and making predictions is part of being actively engaged in what the reader is reading. The purpose of an author is basically why the writer wrote the paper. It's what motivated them to write something. So there's three basic types of motivations or purposes of an author. They either wrote something to inform, entertain, or persuade. So it's important as a reader to understand the purpose of the author because it helps you better understand the text. So generally, it's pretty easy to determine what type of paper something is. So an informative paper is basically when the reader or the writer is just giving the reader facts about something. They're telling them more about something. A paper that is meant to entertain is generally fiction. It's pretty much any kind of fiction work is meant to entertain. Now occasionally fiction will serve a double purpose of also trying to inform, trying to persuade. But generally when something's meant to entertain, generally means that it's some kind of fiction piece. Then finally, the third type, or the third purpose, is to persuade. And this is actually the hardest type to determine because generally an author is going to try to hide that they're trying to persuade you. Because when someone knows they're trying to be persuaded, they're going to be wary or skeptical of the arguments that the writer is throwing at them. So a lot of times a writer will try to disguise their persuasive paper as a paper that's meant to inform or a paper that's meant to entertain, but actually it's meant to persuade the reader. So those are the three main types of purposes of an author: to inform, to entertain, or to persuade. Supporting details are very important parts of a paper. It can be said that the topic and main idea of a paper is the most important part. But without supporting details, main ideas and topics are irrelevant. So basically, supporting details reinforce a larger point. So a writer will make a point which may take the form of a topic or a main idea of a paper. So the writer makes that point, and then the writer backs up their point with supporting details. And these details are most often found in informative and persuasive text. And this makes sense because if the writer is telling you about something, each main point they make, they're also going to need to back up with more points so that the reader can be sure that they are being told accurate information. Then also in a persuasive text, if the writer is trying to get the reader to do something or to think a certain way, the writer can't just make a bunch of points. They're going to have to back up those points so that the reader will indeed think that way or take that action that the writer wants them to take. And supporting details are often easy to spot because the writer will let you know that those details are coming. A lot of times they'll make a main point and then they'll say something like first, and they'll make us give a supporting detail and second, and give another supporting detail and then say finally, and then give the third supporting detail. Or they might say something like for example or for instance, and that would tip you off that the next supporting detail is coming along. Supporting details need to be two things. They need to be both factual and relevant. Because if something is totally accurate and factual, but it's not relevant to the main idea, then it's no good. The supporting detail needs to be accurate and needs to relate back to the main idea. And if a supporting detail is very relevant, if it pertains to the main idea, but is not accurate, then again, it's no good because what good is information that is not true? So the important thing to remember with supporting details is that basically their job is to reinforce a larger point, and they can be most often found in informative and persuasive text. They're often easy to spot because they're preceded by words like first, second, finally, or for instance, or for example. And the most important thing for details to be is both factual and relevant. Text evidence is basically information in a text that backs up the main point or points in general throughout the story. So I want to write up some main points up here about text evidence. So like I said, it supports. The things it supports are the main point or the points throughout the story. So anytime an author makes a claim about something, it's important that they have text evidence. Because when they just make a claim, it's not very credible. And so they add text evidence to it to back up that claim, maybe give a statistic or tell something else to back up the main point or points throughout the story. And text evidence also helps the reader draw a conclusion, or it leads to the conclusion throughout the story. So it's important that text evidence is three things: precise, descriptive, and factual. Remember I said that text evidence supports the main point or points in a story. Well, generally a main point and points throughout a piece of writing are going to be very general. They're not going to be very specific. So since these things are very general, it's important that there are some specifics in the paper. So that's why the text evidence needs to be precise. That way your paper isn't vague, or the writer's paper isn't vague. It's also important that this text evidence is descriptive, because again, main points and points are vague, so it's important to have something very descriptive. And it's also important that they're factual, because since the text evidence is backing up or supporting the main points and points, it's important that these facts or these text evidence is factual so that it's actually credibly backing up the main points and points throughout the story. Topics and main ideas are vital parts of a paper, so it's important that you know how to find the topic and main ideas. But first, we need to understand what those are. So a topic is a subject of a text. Basically, it's what the text is about. And the main idea is the most important point being made. So every paper includes a main idea and a topic. And every paragraph also includes a main idea and a topic. So a topic is very general. A topic is not specific at all. It just tells an overview of what the paper or the paragraph is about. So the topic of a paper could just be tennis. That's the subject of the text, or the text is about tennis. But the main idea is more specific. The main idea is like a thesis statement. It's the most important point being made in the paper. So while the topic might be tennis, the main idea would be tennis is a good form of exercise. So generally you can find the topic and main idea in the first sentence of the paper. So it might say something like, tennis is a great form of exercise. So you know there, the topic's tennis and the main idea is exercise. Or this might also be found at the beginning of a paragraph. If the paper is about something different, the paragraph may have its own topic and main idea. So the first sentence of the paragraph might be, tennis is a great form of exercise. And there, boom, you found the topic and the main idea. Some papers are more difficult and some paragraphs are more difficult, and you may have to read each sentence in that paper or paragraph and find the general theme of all those sentences, what those sentences have in common. But in general, it's very easy to find the topic. You can just scan the paper and figure out what the paper is about, and then more specifically, you can find out what the main idea of the paper is. And since the main idea is the main idea, it's the most important part of the paper, the main idea will be repeated oftentimes throughout the entire paper, generally in the introduction and in the conclusion, and sometimes in between. ACT, English sentence structure. A sentence can be identified according to its structure. So the four different types of structures are simple sentence, compound sentence, complex sentence, and compound complex sentence. So a simple sentence is made up of just an independent clause. An independent clause is a clause that can stand by itself. So here's an example. It rained yesterday. So we have a subject here, it, and a verb, rained. And so this sentence isn't dependent on anything else to be a complete sentence. It's a sentence in its own right because it can stand alone. It rained yesterday is a grammatically correct sentence. So we call that an independent clause. Now, a compound sentence is made up of two or more independent clauses. Now, I'm just going to write here IC for independent clause. And so an example of a compound sentence is she likes to eat fruit and I like to eat vegetables. So notice here that we have a subject and a verb. She likes to eat fruit, and a subject and a verb. I like to eat vegetables. So this is an independent sentence because it could be a sentence by itself, and this is an independent sentence because we could just say I like to eat vegetables, and that's a sentence by itself. But notice here we have them joined together by a comma and the conjunction and. And so there's a few ways you can join two independent clauses together. One is by that example right there, by a comma and a conjunction. And so and is a conjunction as well as words like for, but, so, and yet. And then we can also join two independent clauses by just a semicolon. So right here we could take out the comma and just put a semicolon. It's less common, but it's still grammatically correct. And another way is just to put a conjunction with no comma. Now that wouldn't really be grammatically correct in this sentence right here, but I'm going to show you a sentence in a little bit where this would be appropriate. You only need to do that when you have two short independent clauses being joined together. Now the third sentence structure is a complex sentence. It has one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. So I'm going to write here independent clause and at least one dependent clause. So an example of that is, because I like to drink milk, my bones are very strong. Now here you see the subject I and the verb like. So you have I like to drink milk. You have a subject and a verb, but this is not a complete sentence. This is a dependent clause because of this word right here, because. If you were to say, because I like to drink milk, that wouldn't be a complete sentence. You need something else to it to finish it out. So that's why we call this a dependent clause, because it's dependent on another clause to be complete. Now here, on the other side of this comma, we have an independent clause. Here we have a subject, bones, and a verb, are. So my bones are very strong, can stand alone. So it's joined together with this dependent clause with a comma. Now, dependent clauses can also come after the independent clause, and you could have more than one dependent clause in a complex sentence. Now, a dependent clause is usually introduced by a relative pronoun, such as who, which, that, or something else like that. Or a subordinating conjunction, maybe like although, because, or when. Now finally, we get to the fourth sentence structure, which is a compound complex sentence, which is two or more independent clauses plus one or more dependent clauses. So we have two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. And so an example of that is the plane arrived and we took off because we were already late. So right here we have plane as the subject and arrived as the verb. And then here we have we as the subject and took as the verb. So this is an independent clause right here because it can stand alone. And this is an independent clause. Now right here we have a dependent clause. Now again, we have a subject and we have a verb. We and were are the subject and verb here, but this is not an independent clause. If we were to take the word because off, it would be an independent clause. We were already late. But because of the word because, it's now a dependent clause. Now right here you may be thinking, we have two independent clauses here joined by just a conjunction and no comma, because what you're used to seeing is a comma right here, which that is appropriate. We could also just put a semicolon right here. That would also be appropriate to join the two independent clauses. But we can actually not use a semicolon and we can not use a comma and just have a conjunction, because this is one of the cases where, like I was saying earlier, you just need a conjunction because you have two short independent clauses. So again, the four sentence structure types are the simple sentence, the compound sentence, the complex sentence, and the compound complex sentence. ACT, English sentence structure. Adjectives can be used to compare people, places, or things different in degree. So if you have a one-syllable adjective, you use the suffix or s, or the words in front of it less or least. So say we have the word new, and then we want to make the comparative form of new, we add the suffix er to make it newer. And if we're trying to compare it with three or more objects, then we would put est as the suffix to make it newest. So that's the superlative form. So say you have one car and it's only a month old. You would say you have a new car. Now, if you have a car that's 1 month old and another car that's 2 months old, you would say that the 1 month old car is the newer car. Now, if you're dealing with 3 cars, one's a month old, one's 2 months old, and the other one's 3 months old, you would refer to the car that's a month old as the newest car. Now, this is in the positive sense, whichever one is newer. Now, if we're looking at this more in the negative sense, we could say the comparative form would be less new, and the superlative form would be the least new. So if you have 2 cars, again, you would refer to the one that's 2 months old, the older car, as being less new. And you would refer to the oldest car, if you have 3 or more cars, as being the least new. Now, if you have a two-syllable adjective ending in y, you use the suffix er or est, or you use the words less or least. So say you have the word hungry, you're going to drop the y and change it to I and add er. So change the y to I and add er, so you get hungrier. It's similar with the superlative form. You change the y to I and add est, so you have hungriest. So if you have one person, you would describe them as hungry. With 2 people, you would describe one person as being hungrier, or describe the other person as being less hungry, If you have 3 or more, you would describe one person as being the hungriest, or you would describe someone as being the least hungry. Now, if you have a word with 2 or more syllables, use more or most or less or least. So notice here we're no longer using suffixes. So if something is thrilling and you're comparing it with something else, you would say that one is more thrilling. And then if you have 3 or more, you would describe something as being the most thrilling. And then in the same way as before, you would describe one as being less thrilling or the least thrilling. So say you have one amusement park ride somewhere. You would describe it as thrilling. But if you're dealing with 2 rides, you would describe one as being more thrilling. But if you have a whole amusement park full of rides, you would describe one as being the most thrilling. Now, there are some words that we call irregular. And they're irregular in the way that we form their comparative and superlative. A great example of that is the word bad. The comparative form is worse than, which isn't even another form of bad. And then the superlative form is the worst. So that's a look at unequal comparison adjectives.